There is a form of wealth you've been giving away your entire life, and unlike money, once it's gone, you never truly get it back. Every unnecessary argument, every explanation offered to people determined not to understand you, every emotional reaction to someone who never earned your respect quietly takes another piece of it. You think you're protecting your dignity, you think you're proving your worth. In reality, you're surrendering your peace. By the time the conversation is over, they've already moved on while your mind is still replaying every word. That isn't strength. It's surrender disguised as self-defense. The Stoics understood a truth that most people spend their lives overlooking. The greatest battles are never fought with other people. They are fought over the ownership of your own mind. The world teaches you to react quickly, speak loudly, and defend yourself at every opportunity. Stoicism teaches something far more difficult. It teaches that your attention is your greatest form of power. That silence, when chosen wisely, can be stronger than the perfect argument. That your peace should never be traded for the temporary satisfaction of being right. The moment you stop allowing every opinion, every insult, and every misunderstanding to dictate your inner world is the moment you begin reclaiming a freedom that was always yours. Most people spend their lives trying to master circumstances while neglecting the only thing they truly own, their own mind. They follow every impulse, trust every emotion, and mistake every feeling for truth. Yet the strongest people are rarely the loudest or the quickest to react. They understand that restraint is not weakness, it is discipline. They know that real strength is measured not by how many battles you win, but by how few unnecessary battles you choose to fight. And the more carefully you guard your peace, the harder it becomes for the world to take it away. People believe freedom arrives when difficult people disappear from their lives, but experience suggests otherwise. New environments bring new personalities. Different workplaces introduce different challenges. Every stage of life carries its own frustrations. Waiting for the world to become peaceful before finding peace within yourself is a bargain reality never accepts. The Stoic approach offers something far more dependable. Instead of demanding that life become easier, it asks you to become steadier. That shift sounds simple, yet it changes the direction of your attention completely. Energy once spent wishing circumstances were different gradually becomes available for observing your own responses with greater honesty and patience. This observation is not an act of self-criticism, it is an act of self-understanding. There is a meaningful difference between noticing a reaction and becoming ashamed of it. Everyone experiences anger, disappointment, fear, and regret. These emotions belong to the human experience, not to personal failure. The problem begins only when those emotions quietly assume control without being questioned. A passing feeling becomes an unquestioned belief. A temporary frustration becomes an identity. Before long, a single difficult moment begins influencing decisions that have nothing to do with the original event. Recognizing this process does not eliminate emotion overnight, but it creates something far more valuable than immediate relief. It creates space. Within that space, a different response becomes possible. Instead of immediately believing every thought, you begin observing it. Instead of assuming every emotional impulse deserves action, you allow it to exist without rushing behind it. That small pause rarely feels dramatic. In fact, it often feels almost invisible. Yet many lasting changes begin exactly there. The mind slowly discovers that not every memory deserves another rehearsal, not every criticism deserves another defense, and not every uncomfortable feeling deserves permanent residence. As this understanding grows stronger, the world gradually loses its ability to occupy your inner life without permission, and the quiet discipline of guarding your own mind becomes less like a practice and more like the natural way you choose to live. Your emotions move far faster than your judgment ever could. A message goes unanswered longer than expected. Someone dismisses an idea you believed was reasonable. A careless remark lands with more force than it should. Within seconds, your mind begins preparing for battle. You rehearse explanations that have not been asked for. You build arguments no one has made yet. You start searching for the perfect sentence that will restore your dignity, change their opinion, or prove that you were right all along. It happens so quickly that it feels automatic, almost as if you never had a choice. The body tightens before the mind has fully understood what happened. Thoughts accelerate, attention narrows, everything else disappears while one small moment quietly expands until it occupies your entire awareness. This reaction feels deeply personal, yet it is something nearly every human mind has been conditioned to do. The brain evolved to notice threats quickly because, for most of history, hesitation could be dangerous. The problem is that modern discomfort often borrows the same alarm system once reserved for genuine survival. An uncomfortable conversation now triggers a response once meant for escaping real danger, and without realizing it, you begin treating ordinary moments as though your entire identity depends on winning them. That is why emotional reactions often feel so convincing. They arrive carrying a sense of urgency that makes immediate action appear necessary. Remaining silent feels weak. Waiting feels risky. Reflection feels like surrender. The mind insists that something must be done now before the opportunity disappears forever. Yet urgency is not always wisdom. Many of the decisions people regret most were not made because they lacked intelligence. They were made because emotion convinced them that speed mattered more than clarity. A message sent in frustration, a relationship damaged by pride, a conversation that escalated simply because neither person was willing to pause. Looking back, the situation often appears surprisingly small, yet in the moment it seemed enormous. The difference was never the event itself, it was the emotional state through which the event was interpreted. The Stoics recognized this long before psychology gave it modern language. They understood that the first movement of emotion is often beyond conscious control, but what follows belongs to us. Anger may appear unexpectedly, fear may arise without permission, disappointment may settle into the heart before reason has spoken. None of these experiences make someone weak, they make someone human. The real question begins only after that first wave arrives. Does the emotion become your guide, or does it become something you quietly observe? That distinction separates reaction from discipline. One allows impulse to decide the future. The other creates enough distance for wisdom to enter the conversation. Sometimes that distance lasts only a few seconds, yet those few seconds often determine whether a difficult moment quietly fades away or becomes another memory carried for years. Think about how many conflicts grow larger simply because neither person allows silence to exist. One sentence demands another. One accusation invites a defense. One misunderstanding turns into 10 more because everyone involved feels compelled to protect an image of themselves. The conversation slowly stops being about the original issue. Instead, it becomes a struggle over pride, certainty, and control. At that point, no one is truly listening anymore. Each person waits only for the chance to speak again. The desire to understand disappears beneath the stronger desire to be understood. Ironically, the more desperately people seek validation in these moments, the further they move away from genuine connection. Winning the exchange becomes more important than preserving peace, and the cost is rarely noticed until much later. This is why learning to pause is far more powerful than learning to argue. A pause interrupts patterns that have been repeated for years. It prevents emotions from immediately transforming into actions. It creates a brief opening where perspective has room to appear. During that quiet moment, something remarkable becomes possible. You begin asking different questions. Instead of wondering how to defeat the other person, you wonder whether the conflict deserves your energy at all. Instead of searching for perfect words, you become curious about why those words suddenly feel so necessary. Often the strongest urge to react says less about the situation itself and more about an insecurity waiting beneath it. Seeing that clearly is uncomfortable, but it is also deeply liberating because it shifts attention away from controlling others and toward understanding yourself. This awareness gradually changes the way ordinary moments unfold. An ignored message no longer becomes immediate evidence of rejection. A disagreement no longer threatens your sense of worth. Criticism becomes something to examine instead of something to survive. None of this happens because life suddenly becomes easier. Difficult people still exist. Misunderstandings still happen. Expectations are still disappointed. The external world remains unpredictable, but your relationship with those experiences begins to change. What once demanded instant reaction now receives quiet observation. What once consumed an entire day gradually loses its ability to occupy more than a few moments. The situation may remain exactly the same, yet your inner experience becomes remarkably different because your attention is no longer controlled by every emotional impulse that appears. Perhaps this is the first meaningful victory anyone can achieve. It is not found in persuading another person, delivering the perfect response, or walking away admired by everyone involved. It begins much earlier than that. It begins in the silent instant when you notice an emotion asking to take control, and instead of obeying it automatically, you simply allow yourself to breathe before deciding what comes next. That single moment rarely receives recognition from the outside world. No applause follows it. No one congratulates you for choosing restraint over impulse. Yet those unnoticed moments quietly reshape a person's character over time. Every deliberate pause weakens an old habit and strengthens a new one. Little by little, reactions become responses, urgency gives way to clarity, and the mind discovers a freedom that was never hidden from the world, only overlooked within itself. If these reflections are helping you see yourself a little more clearly, consider subscribing. As a quiet commitment to strengthening your mind, protecting your peace, and continuing the lifelong practice of living with greater wisdom. Attention is one of the few resources you spend every single day without ever seeing it leave your hands. You notice money disappearing from your wallet. You notice hours passing on a clock, but attention slips away almost invisibly, carried off by small frustrations, pointless disagreements, and problems that were never truly yours to solve. By the end of the day, you feel mentally exhausted without understanding why. It wasn't one major event that drained you. It was hundreds of tiny moments where your focus was quietly pulled away from what actually mattered. A thought here, an argument there, a criticism you kept replaying, a conversation you wished had gone differently. None of these moments seemed significant on their own, yet together they formed an invisible tax on your peace. The Stoics understood that a person's life is shaped less by dramatic events than by the steady direction of their attention. Whatever repeatedly occupies the mind gradually becomes the world that person lives inside. This is why attention behaves much like currency. Every decision about where to place it carries a hidden cost. When you spend money, you naturally ask whether something is worth the price. Yet very few people ask the same question before giving away an afternoon of emotional energy. Someone leaves a rude comment online and suddenly 30 minutes disappear. A stranger's opinion becomes more important than your own goals. An unnecessary disagreement keeps returning to your thoughts, while the work that truly mattered remains unfinished. Nothing valuable was gained, yet something valuable was certainly lost. As Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, the happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. Attention, unlike money, cannot be earned back once the moment has passed. Every hour spent feeding resentment is an hour that can never be invested in growth, creativity, meaningful relationships, or simple peace of mind. This is not merely about productivity. It is about the quality of the life you are quietly creating through repeated choices that often seem too small to notice. The difficult part is that the mind does not naturally distinguish between investments and expenses. It treats whatever captures emotion as though it deserves importance. A careless remark can feel just as urgent as an opportunity that could genuinely improve your future. This is why people sometimes spend days thinking about someone they neither respect nor admire. Emotion creates the illusion of significance. The stronger the emotional reaction, the more valuable the subject appears to become. Yet intensity and importance are not the same thing. Many experiences that provoke the strongest reactions deserve the least amount of attention. Recognizing that difference requires discipline, because the mind rarely volunteers to let go of something that wounded its pride. It would rather continue carrying the burden than admit the burden was never worth carrying in the first place. Consider how differently your days might unfold if every demand for your attention faced a simple moment of examination before receiving your energy. Not every opinion deserves reflection. Not every criticism deserves analysis. Not every misunderstanding deserves correction. Some situations naturally resolve themselves the moment you stop feeding them. Others reveal their true insignificance after a single night's rest. The urge to respond immediately often comes from fear rather than wisdom. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of appearing weak, fear of losing approval. Yet the more often you surrender your attention to those fears, the more dependent your peace becomes upon circumstances you cannot control. Quietly, almost without noticing, other people begin deciding what occupies your mind instead of you deciding for yourself. This gradual loss of ownership explains why so many people feel constantly busy yet strangely unfulfilled. Their attention has become fragmented into hundreds of competing demands. A notification interrupts concentration. An argument interrupts calm. Worry interrupts gratitude. Regret interrupts the present moment. The mind jumps endlessly between unfinished thoughts until genuine stillness begins to feel unfamiliar. The Stoics viewed this scattered state not as an unavoidable part of life, but as a habit that could be corrected through deliberate practice. Every time you consciously return your focus to what is actually within your influence, you strengthen the ability to remain steady despite whatever noise surrounds you. Like any discipline, it grows quietly through repetition rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Over time, this changes something deeper than daily habits. It changes your relationship with yourself. You begin trusting your own judgment more because it is no longer constantly interrupted by every passing distraction. Decisions become clearer because they arise from reflection instead of emotional urgency. Conversations become calmer because you no longer feel obligated to defend every opinion or answer every challenge. There is a quiet confidence that develops when your attention belongs primarily to your values instead of other people's reactions. It is not arrogance nor indifference. It is simply the understanding that your inner life deserves careful protection because everything meaningful you will ever build begins there. Once attention is treated as something precious rather than unlimited, even ordinary moments acquire greater depth, and the constant search for external validation slowly loses its grip. Perhaps this is the hidden difference between merely existing and living intentionally. One person allows the world to determine where attention goes from one moment to the next. Another quietly chooses. That choice seems small, almost invisible, yet its effects accumulate over months and years until two entirely different lives emerge. One becomes crowded with unnecessary battles, unfinished resentment, and mental exhaustion. The other becomes defined by clarity, purpose, and an increasing sense of freedom that no circumstance can easily disturb. Every moment your attention returns to what truly deserves it becomes an investment in the person you are slowly becoming, and that investment compounds in ways that no external achievement ever could. One of the quiet truths about human behavior is that people who constantly provoke others are often searching for something far more valuable than agreement. They are searching for engagement. Attention becomes their reward, whether it arrives as admiration, frustration, anger, or resistance. It makes little difference as long as they succeed in pulling someone into their emotional orbit. That is why so many conflicts seem to grow out of almost nothing. A passing remark becomes an argument. A minor disagreement becomes a personal attack. A careless opinion somehow occupies an entire afternoon. The original issue was never powerful enough to create such turmoil on its own. What gave it strength was participation. As Epictetus observed, if someone succeeds in provoking you, realize that your mind is complicit in the provocation. The moment you become emotionally invested in proving someone wrong or defending yourself against every criticism, the conversation quietly changes direction. It is no longer about truth or understanding. It becomes a struggle over attention, and attention is one of the easiest things to lose when emotion takes the lead. This is why some people seem remarkably skilled at creating conflict wherever they go. They instinctively understand that emotional reactions are contagious. One raised voice invites another. One accusation encourages a defense. One sarcastic comment creates the temptation to answer with another. Before long, two people who may have started with a simple misunderstanding find themselves trapped inside a conversation neither of them truly wanted. Each response fuels the next, almost like adding wood to a fire that was already beginning to fade. Without fresh fuel, many disagreements would naturally disappear. Yet the human mind often mistakes participation for strength. It whispers that silence means defeat, that every insult deserves an answer, and that every misunderstanding must be corrected immediately. The result is predictable. More energy is spent protecting pride than preserving peace. The Stoics recognized something remarkably practical about these moments. They understood that another person's behavior does not automatically become your responsibility. Someone else's anger belongs to them until you decide to carry it yourself. Their impatience does not become your impatience unless you allow it to shape your response. Their frustration cannot invade your inner world without your cooperation. This realization is both simple and difficult because it places responsibility back where it belongs. Instead of asking why people behave poorly, attention shifts toward a more meaningful question. Why should another person's lack of discipline determine the quality of your own mind? That perspective does not excuse harmful behavior, nor does it suggest accepting disrespect without boundaries. It simply refuses to surrender self-control in response to someone else's loss of theirs. Many people believe they are standing up for themselves when they react impulsively, yet the opposite is often true. Every emotional outburst quietly hands control to whatever triggered it. Think about how easily an entire day can be shaped by one unpleasant interaction. A stranger's comment follows you into lunch. A disagreement at work sits beside you throughout the evening. Hours later, your thoughts are still revolving around someone who has probably forgotten the conversation entirely. They no longer need to continue disturbing you because your own mind has taken over that task. This is how emotional influence works. It rarely depends on the other person remaining present. Once the reaction has been accepted, the mind continues producing it without assistance. The external disturbance ends quickly, but the internal disturbance continues through repetition. That repetition creates the illusion that reacting is helping. The mind convinces itself that replaying the conversation will eventually produce relief, as though finding a better response could somehow rewrite what has already happened. Instead, each rehearsal strengthens the emotional imprint. Every imaginary argument makes the next one easier to revisit. Gradually, reacting becomes less about solving problems and more about maintaining familiar patterns. The conversation exists only in memory, yet the body continues responding as though the conflict is unfolding in real time. Stress increases, patience decreases, clarity fades. None of this happens because the situation remains unresolved. It happens because attention continues feeding an experience that should have ended long ago. There is another way to approach these moments, though it often feels uncomfortable at first. Rather than immediately responding, you simply observe what is happening inside yourself. You notice the urge to defend your reputation. You notice the impulse to explain every detail. You notice how quickly the mind begins searching for victory instead of understanding. That observation alone creates distance. It interrupts the automatic pattern before it becomes action. The emotion may still be present, but it no longer occupies the driver's seat. It becomes something witnessed instead of something obeyed. This quiet pause rarely changes the other person's behavior, yet it changes something much more important. It protects your ability to choose your own. Over time, this practice transforms interactions in ways that are difficult to appreciate until they become part of everyday life. Situations that once consumed hours begin fading within minutes. Words that previously felt unbearable lose much of their emotional weight. You stop measuring success by whether another person finally understands you and begin measuring it by whether you remained faithful to your own principles. The desire to win every exchange slowly gives way to something steadier and more lasting. You discover that calm is not weakness, restraint is not surrender, and silence is not an admission of defeat. They are often the clearest signs that your attention still belongs to you. When that understanding becomes deeply rooted, provoking you becomes remarkably difficult, because your peace no longer depends on controlling another person's behavior. It rests upon something far more stable, the discipline to decide which moments deserve entry into your mind and which are simply allowed to pass. There comes a moment when you quietly decline an invitation that most people accept without thinking. It is not an invitation to a meeting or a conversation. It is an invitation to become emotionally entangled in someone else's expectations, frustrations, or judgments. For years, accepting that invitation may have felt automatic. Criticism appeared, and your mind immediately searched for evidence to defend itself. Someone misunderstood your intentions, and you felt responsible for correcting every detail. An unfair accusation landed in front of you, and silence seemed impossible because remaining quiet felt almost identical to admitting defeat. Yet something begins to change when you stop treating every challenge as a command to react. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You always own the option of having no opinion." You realize that not every opinion deserves access to your inner world. Not every misunderstanding requires a carefully crafted explanation. Not every uncomfortable moment must be escaped immediately. The space that once felt threatening slowly becomes a place where clarity begins to grow. At first, this feels strangely uncomfortable because the habit of defending yourself has probably been practiced for years. The mind has learned to associate explanation with safety. It quietly believes that if only people understood your intentions, everything would finally settle into place. But life rarely works that way. Some people misunderstand because they lack information. Others misunderstand because they have already chosen a conclusion before listening. No amount of additional explanation changes a mind that has no interest in understanding. Continuing to pour energy into those conversations becomes like trying to fill a container with a hole in the bottom. You keep giving more, hoping the outcome will eventually change, while never noticing how much of yourself is quietly draining away. The effort becomes exhausting, not because explaining is always wrong, but because constant explanation slowly teaches you that your peace depends upon another person's agreement. The Stoics approached these situations from an entirely different direction. They understood that peace built upon external approval is always unstable, because approval itself constantly changes. One day people praise you, another day they criticize you. One conversation ends with understanding, another with disappointment. If your inner stability rises and falls alongside those reactions, then your emotional life never truly belongs to you. It belongs to circumstances. It belongs to changing opinions. It belongs to people who often do not realize the influence they hold over your thoughts. Freedom begins the moment you stop handing out that authority so freely. It is not an act of indifference toward others. It is an act of responsibility toward yourself. You begin recognizing that preserving a calm mind is not selfish. It is the foundation that allows every meaningful relationship, decision, and action to rest upon something solid rather than something constantly shaken. This realization often arrives quietly rather than dramatically. One day you notice yourself listening to criticism without immediately preparing your defense. The familiar urge still appears, but instead of following it automatically, you simply observe it. You notice your heartbeat increase. You notice your thoughts searching for perfect responses. You notice pride asking for immediate action. Then something unexpected happens. You choose not to obey that first impulse. The conversation continues, but your attention no longer races ahead, trying to control every outcome. Instead, you remain present. You hear more than just the words being spoken. You begin noticing tone, intention, and even your own assumptions. What once felt like a battle gradually becomes an opportunity to understand both yourself and the situation more clearly. Silence plays an important role in this process, although it is often misunderstood. Many people associate silence with weakness because they assume strength must always announce itself. Yet genuine composure rarely needs to compete for attention. Silence creates room for observation. It prevents unnecessary words from strengthening unnecessary conflicts. It gives emotions time to settle before decisions are made. Most importantly, it reminds you that immediate reaction is not the only available choice. A quiet pause often reveals that what seemed urgent only moments ago was simply emotional momentum asking to be continued. Once that momentum fades, the situation frequently appears much smaller than it first seemed. The problem did not necessarily disappear. Your perspective simply became larger than the problem itself. As you practice this discipline, something remarkable begins returning to you. Parts of yourself that had been scattered across countless conversations slowly come home again. You stop measuring your worth by whether every person approves of you. You stop carrying yesterday's disagreements into tomorrow's opportunities. Energy once consumed by proving yourself becomes available for creating, learning, strengthening relationships, and living more intentionally. You begin noticing beauty that constant mental conflict had quietly hidden. Ordinary mornings feel calmer because your thoughts are no longer occupied by imaginary debates. Simple conversations become richer because you are listening instead of rehearsing responses. Even moments of solitude feel different because your own mind gradually becomes a place of rest instead of relentless argument. This transformation is rarely visible to the outside world. No one applauds the argument you refuse to continue or the explanation you wisely decided not to give. Yet those unseen choices shape your character far more than dramatic victories ever could. Every unnecessary reaction left behind becomes evidence that your attention is no longer controlled by every passing opinion. Every moment of restraint strengthens the quiet confidence that comes from governing yourself instead of attempting to govern everyone else. Eventually, you realize you never lost anything by refusing those invitations to conflict. What you actually recovered was something infinitely more valuable. You recovered the ability to remain whole regardless of how the world chooses to respond, and that quiet wholeness becomes a source of strength no argument could ever provide. Silence has a way of revealing things that words often hide. Most people think of silence as the absence of action, but in reality it is often the moment when action becomes impossible to fake. When someone expects an immediate reaction and receives none, the entire rhythm of the interaction changes. The script they had already written in their mind suddenly stops working. They expected frustration. They expected defense. They expected an emotional exchange that would confirm whatever story they had already decided to believe. Instead, they are left with something unfamiliar. They are left with themselves. That quiet interruption may last only a few seconds, yet it has the power to expose motives that endless arguments never could. As Epictetus wisely said, first learn the meaning of what you say and then speak. The Stoics understood that composure is not simply the ability to remain calm, it is the ability to refuse becoming a character in someone else's emotional performance. People grow comfortable with patterns. They learn which words provoke certain reactions, which topics create tension, and which comments almost always produce a predictable response. Sometimes this happens consciously, but more often it happens without anyone realizing it. A sarcastic remark is followed by irritation. Criticism is followed by explanation. Disrespect is followed by anger. These repeated exchanges become habits shared by both people involved. Each person unknowingly teaches the other what to expect next. That is why many relationships, whether personal or professional, seem trapped inside the same conversations over and over again. Different days bring different details, but the emotional pattern rarely changes. The words are new, the reactions are old. The moment one person quietly steps outside that familiar pattern, everything begins shifting. Nothing dramatic has happened on the surface. No speech has been delivered. No lesson has been taught. Yet the emotional momentum suddenly has nowhere to travel. It is much like pushing against a door that unexpectedly swings open instead of resisting. All the force prepared for conflict suddenly loses its purpose. Instead of drawing you into frustration, the other person is left holding the emotion they intended to pass on. They must now decide what to do with it themselves. Sometimes they become quieter, sometimes they become louder, sometimes they lose interest altogether because the response they were expecting never arrived. Whatever happens next belongs to them, not to you. This is one of the least understood forms of influence. Many people assume influence comes from saying the perfect thing or winning every disagreement through logic. Yet some of the strongest influence comes from refusing to strengthen an unhealthy pattern. When you stop rewarding manipulation with emotional energy, manipulation gradually loses much of its effectiveness. When you stop defending yourself against every unfair judgment, those judgments begin losing their ability to dominate your attention. This is not about controlling another person's behavior. It is about refusing to become predictable in ways that weaken your own peace. There is tremendous freedom in no longer reacting according to someone else's expectations. Of course, remaining silent is not always easy. There is a powerful urge to explain yourself, especially when you know you are being misunderstood. The mind insists that one more sentence will finally make everything clear. One more argument will surely change their opinion. One more attempt will restore fairness. Sometimes that is true. Honest conversations deserve honesty in return. But there are also moments when explanation serves only the person demanding it. They are not searching for understanding, they are searching for engagement. Every answer becomes another opportunity to continue the conflict. Every defense becomes another invitation to question your motives. Without realizing it, you begin spending more effort maintaining the disagreement than resolving it. The Stoic perspective encourages a different form of strength. Instead of asking how to convince everyone around you, it asks whether their approval is truly necessary for your peace. That question changes the direction of your attention. It reminds you that dignity is not created by endless self-defense. Character is not measured by how effectively you answer every criticism. Much of genuine confidence comes from knowing that your values remain intact even when someone refuses to recognize them. There is no need to chase validation from a mind that has already decided against understanding. Sometimes the wisest response is not another explanation, but the quiet confidence to let misunderstanding exist without allowing it to define you. Something else begins happening as this discipline develops. You start seeing people more clearly because your own emotions no longer cloud every interaction. Instead of immediately judging their words, you begin noticing their patterns. You recognize who listens with curiosity and who listens only to prepare another attack. You notice who genuinely seeks resolution and who seems energized by conflict itself. These observations become possible because your attention is no longer consumed by defending yourself. Emotional distance creates clearer perception. You are finally able to separate another person's behavior from your own responsibility. Ironically, silence often encourages more honest behavior from others than argument ever could. When someone cannot provoke the expected reaction, they sometimes reveal far more about themselves than they intended. Frustration becomes visible, insecurity becomes obvious. The need for control quietly rises to the surface. None of this requires you to expose them. Their own actions accomplish that naturally. The absence of your participation becomes a mirror reflecting whatever they continue bringing into the conversation. This is why restraint can feel surprisingly powerful. It allows reality to speak without unnecessary interference. There is also an important lesson hidden within your own experience. Every time you choose not to react impulsively, you strengthen trust in yourself. You discover that uncomfortable emotions do not have to become immediate actions. You learn that criticism can exist without stealing your peace, and that disagreement does not automatically threaten your identity. Little by little, your confidence stops depending on successful conversations and begins resting upon consistent self-control. That foundation is far more stable because it cannot be taken away by another person's mood or opinion. With enough practice, the need to win every exchange slowly fades. You realize that many victories cost more than they are worth. They consume time, attention, and emotional energy that could have been invested elsewhere. Meanwhile, the quiet victories often go unnoticed. They happen when you refuse to carry resentment into the next day. They happen when someone else's frustration ends with them instead of continuing through you. They happen when your inner world remains steady despite circumstances inviting chaos. Those moments rarely receive recognition from anyone else, yet they quietly transform the quality of your life. Eventually, you begin understanding that silence is not empty at all. It is filled with observation, patience, discipline, and choice. It interrupts old patterns, protects your attention, and gives both you and the people around you an opportunity to step outside habits that once seemed inevitable. Some will misunderstand that choice. Others will respect it. Neither response matters as much as the deeper truth it reinforces. Every moment you refuse to participate in unnecessary emotional games, you reclaim another small part of your freedom, and over time, those small victories accumulate into a calm presence that no longer depends on controlling anyone except yourself. Many people misunderstand emotional discipline because they confuse it with emotional absence. They picture someone who never smiles, never grieves, never feels excitement or disappointment. They imagine a person who has built such thick walls around the heart that nothing can ever enter. That was never the aim. Stoicism does not ask you to become less human. It asks you to become less controlled by the parts of yourself that change from one moment to the next. Feelings are natural. They rise without permission, often before thought has fully awakened. A sudden wave of frustration, a quiet sense of fear, a spark of jealousy, a moment of sadness that arrives without warning. None of these emotions are failures. They are signals. They are reminders that something inside you has noticed the world. The difficulty begins only when those signals immediately become commands. The moment emotion stops being something you experience and starts becoming something that directs your behavior, you quietly surrender the freedom to choose your next step. Think about how quickly this happens during ordinary moments. A critical comment appears, and irritation immediately insists that you respond. An unexpected setback arrives, and discouragement begins predicting a future that has not happened yet. Someone else succeeds, and comparison quietly whispers that you are falling behind. These reactions often feel so immediate that they seem inseparable from reality itself. Yet there is an important difference between what you feel and what is true. Feelings describe your present experience, but they do not always describe the world accurately. Fear often predicts disasters that never arrive. Anger exaggerates offenses that appear much smaller after time has passed. Anxiety speaks with absolute certainty about futures that exist only inside imagination. If every feeling automatically became a decision, your life would constantly change direction according to whatever emotion happened to arrive first. Stability would become almost impossible because your inner world would always be governed by passing weather rather than lasting principles. The Stoics understood that the first movement of emotion belongs to human nature, but the second movement belongs to character. You may not choose the first flash of disappointment or frustration, but you can choose whether it remains in control. This small distinction is easy to overlook because it happens so quickly. Between the emotion and the action exists a space so brief that many people never notice it. Yet within that space lies one of the greatest forms of freedom available to any person. As Epictetus taught, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. It is the place where observation becomes stronger than impulse. Instead of reacting automatically, you begin witnessing your own mind at work. You notice anger asking to speak. You notice fear asking to retreat. You notice pride asking to defend itself. Rather than obeying immediately, you allow each emotion to exist without placing it in charge of your behavior. At first, this practice feels unnatural because the mind has spent years believing that speed equals safety. It tells you that hesitation is weakness and that immediate action proves confidence. But experience teaches something different. Many regrets begin with reactions that felt completely justified in the moment. Words spoken in anger, decisions made from fear, relationships damaged by pride. Looking back, clarity almost always arrives after emotion has settled. The problem is not that wisdom appears too late. The problem is that people often refuse to wait long enough for wisdom to speak before acting. The pause itself becomes uncomfortable because it interrupts familiar habits. Yet discomfort is not always a sign that something is wrong. Sometimes it is evidence that an old pattern is finally beginning to loosen its grip. This gradual shift transforms not only the way you respond to difficult moments, but also the way you understand yourself. You stop identifying completely with every feeling that passes through your mind. Instead of saying, "I am angry," you quietly recognize that anger is present. Instead of believing fear defines your future, you acknowledge that fear has arrived without assuming it knows the truth. That subtle change creates remarkable psychological distance. You are no longer fused with every emotional experience. You become the observer capable of witnessing those experiences without being carried away by them. The mind grows calmer because it no longer treats every internal movement as an emergency demanding immediate action. Over time, this way of living reshapes your relationships, your decisions, and even the conversations you have with yourself. Patience replaces urgency. Reflection begins arriving before reaction. Difficult moments still appear, but they no longer determine the direction of your entire day. People may continue speaking carelessly. Circumstances may still change without warning. Life remains unpredictable because that has always been its nature. Yet something essential has changed within you. You have discovered that freedom is not found by eliminating emotion, but by refusing to surrender your judgment to it. In that quiet space between feeling and action, where reason is finally given room to breathe, a steadier life slowly begins to emerge. It is not a life without emotion. It is a life where emotion is honored, understood, and guided rather than obeyed, and that gentle mastery becomes one of the strongest foundations upon which lasting peace can be built. Many people quietly convince themselves that always being available is a sign of compassion. They answer every message the moment it arrives. They rearrange their schedule to solve problems that were never theirs to carry. They explain every decision as though they need permission to live according to their own values. They worry about disappointing everyone around them, while rarely asking whether they are disappointing themselves. From the outside, this behavior often looks generous. People describe it as kindness, reliability, or selflessness. Yet beneath that constant willingness to give is often a fear that saying no will lead to rejection, conflict, or disappointment. The habit grows so gradually that it becomes part of someone's identity. They no longer recognize it as a choice. They simply believe this is who they are. Then one day they notice something difficult to ignore. Despite doing everything they believed a good person should do, they feel emotionally exhausted. Their patience grows shorter, their mind feels crowded, their peace becomes increasingly difficult to recover. The strange part is that nothing dramatic caused this exhaustion. It accumulated quietly through hundreds of small moments where their attention belonged to everyone except themselves. This happens because energy follows attention, whether we notice it or not. Wherever the mind repeatedly goes, emotional resources quietly follow. Every unnecessary obligation consumes a little more focus. Every problem accepted without question occupies another corner of the mind. Every attempt to keep everyone satisfied leaves less room for reflection, creativity, and rest. Most people never think of attention as something limited because they cannot see it being spent. Yet by the end of the day, they feel the consequences. Their body may be sitting peacefully in a quiet room while their thoughts remain scattered across dozens of unfinished conversations, responsibilities, and expectations. They replay requests they agreed to, despite not wanting to. They worry about reactions that have not happened yet. They continue carrying burdens that belong to someone else from the very beginning. Over time, they stop feeling like the owner of their own life and begin feeling like the caretaker of everyone else's emotional comfort. The Stoics viewed this differently because they understood that responsibility has boundaries. Compassion does not require constant availability. Generosity does not require self-neglect. Supporting others loses much of its meaning when it is done by abandoning your own stability in the process. A person who constantly empties themselves eventually has very little left to offer anyone. This is why caring for your own inner life is not an act of selfishness. It is an act of stewardship. Just as a garden cannot nourish others if it is never watered, the mind cannot continue giving patience, wisdom, or understanding if it is continually deprived of quiet, reflection, and renewal. Protecting your own attention is not withdrawing from life. It is ensuring that when you do give your presence, it is genuine rather than exhausted. Part of the difficulty comes from confusing approval with connection. Many people believe they strengthen relationships by always saying yes, always responding immediately, and always placing other people's priorities ahead of their own. Yet relationships built upon constant availability often become dependent rather than healthy. Expectations quietly grow. Boundaries slowly disappear. The more consistently you sacrifice your own needs, the more ordinary that sacrifice begins to seem. What was once appreciated gradually becomes expected, not because people are necessarily ungrateful, but because human beings naturally adapt to what is repeatedly available. When your time, attention, and emotional energy are offered without limit, they slowly stop being recognized as valuable. This is one of the quiet paradoxes of life. The things we protect carefully often become respected. The things we give away endlessly often become invisible. Learning to establish boundaries therefore begins with changing the way you think about your own attention. Instead of asking whether someone wants it, you begin asking whether giving it aligns with the life you are trying to build. This does not mean becoming distant or indifferent. It means becoming intentional. Some conversations deserve your full presence. Some responsibilities deserve your effort. Some people genuinely enrich your life through mutual respect and care. Others simply consume whatever is available without considering the cost. Recognizing that difference requires honesty because it asks you to notice where your energy repeatedly disappears. It also asks you to accept that not every request deserves the same response. Sometimes the wisest decision is not doing more. It is preserving enough of yourself to continue acting with patience rather than obligation. There is another quiet shift that happens as you become more selective with your attention. Guilt often appears before peace does. The first time you decline an unnecessary request, the mind immediately questions your decision. It worries that someone may think less of you. It wonders whether you should have explained yourself more carefully. Old habits rarely disappear without resistance. They remind you of the version of yourself that believed acceptance depended upon constant sacrifice. But if you remain patient through that discomfort, something unexpected begins taking its place. The guilt gradually becomes lighter. The quiet becomes less frightening. You begin discovering that people who genuinely value you often respect honest boundaries far more than endless accommodation. Those who become angry simply because you protected your own peace frequently reveal that they valued your availability more than your well-being. Perhaps the greatest transformation is that your kindness becomes stronger rather than weaker. It is no longer driven by fear of disappointing others, but by genuine willingness to contribute where it truly matters. You give because you choose to, not because you feel unable to refuse. That distinction changes everything. The presence you offer becomes more meaningful because it is intentional. Your patience lasts longer because it is no longer constantly depleted. Your compassion becomes steadier because it grows from abundance instead of exhaustion. In protecting your own attention, you discover that boundaries do not separate you from others. They allow you to remain fully present in the moments that deserve your heart, your mind, and your energy, while quietly releasing the countless demands that never truly belonged to you in the first place. The Stoics often reflected on the fact that life is limited, yet there is something even more delicate than time itself. Time continues moving, whether you use it wisely or not. Attention is different. It can disappear in an instant without you realizing it has gone. A single conversation lasting only a few minutes can quietly follow you through the rest of the day. One careless sentence from someone whose opinion barely matters can echo through your thoughts long after their voice has faded. Hours pass. Your surroundings change. New opportunities appear in front of you, yet your mind remains anchored to a moment that no longer exists. The event ended almost immediately, but your attention continues breathing life into it. This is how ordinary experiences slowly become invisible prisons. They do not imprison your body, they occupy your awareness, and wherever awareness remains, a part of your life quietly remains with it. It is surprising how little is required to distract the human mind from the present. A brief misunderstanding, an unexpected criticism, a disappointed expectation. None of these experiences last very long on their own, yet the imagination possesses an extraordinary ability to extend them far beyond their natural life. You replay the conversation while preparing breakfast. You revisit it while driving home. You imagine different responses before falling asleep. Each replay feels as though you are solving something important, but often nothing is actually changing. The mind simply returns because unfinished emotions have a way of disguising themselves as unfinished problems. It convinces you that one more review of the situation will finally produce clarity. Instead, the same thoughts travel familiar paths until repetition begins to feel like progress. Without noticing it, the memory becomes more active than the present moment unfolding right in front of you. The Stoics believed that much of human suffering grows not from events themselves, but from the permission we unknowingly grant them to remain within us. A difficult moment deserves attention while it is happening. It deserves reflection afterward if there is something meaningful to learn. But there is a difference between learning from an experience and living inside it long after it has passed. Many people continue carrying conversations that no longer exist because they believe letting go somehow means pretending the event never happened. Yet letting go does not erase memory. It simply removes the unnecessary burden of carrying it everywhere you go. Wisdom remembers without becoming trapped. It learns without endlessly returning to the same emotional ground. This becomes especially clear when you consider how often your emotional world begins revolving around people who have already moved on. Someone makes an insensitive remark and forgets it before lunch. Meanwhile, you continue thinking about it through the evening. A stranger expresses an opinion that clashes with yours, then continues living their day without another thought. Yet, your own mind continues defending itself against someone who is no longer mentally present. The imbalance is remarkable. One person has already left the conversation while the other remains there alone, continuing an argument that now exists only inside imagination. In moments like these, the greatest influence over your peace no longer belongs to the other person. It belongs to the attention you continue investing in an experience that has already ended. This practice requires patience because the mind does not surrender familiar habits easily. It enjoys returning to unfinished stories, especially those involving pride or regret. There is comfort in familiar suffering because it asks nothing new from you. Growth, on the other hand, requires allowing the past to become what it already is, the past. That does not mean forgetting important lessons or pretending painful experiences never happened. It means refusing to let yesterday continually borrow today's attention. Every moment spent mentally reliving an experience is a moment unavailable for creating something better in the present. The future is quietly shaped by wherever your attention repeatedly rests, and no meaningful future can be built while your mind remains permanently occupied by moments that no longer exist. Little by little, this understanding changes the way ordinary days unfold. A careless remark still reaches your ears, but it no longer follows you home. A disappointing interaction still happens, yet it no longer occupies your thoughts until bedtime. You notice the impulse to replay the moment, but instead of obeying it automatically, you allow it to pass like countless other thoughts that come and go throughout the day. The memory loses strength, not because you forced yourself to forget it, but because you stopped feeding it the attention it needed to survive. The emotional charge gradually fades, leaving only the lesson behind. That lesson becomes useful because it no longer arrives wrapped in unnecessary suffering. Perhaps this is one of the quietest forms of freedom a person can discover. It is not the freedom of controlling every circumstance or preventing every disappointment. It is the freedom of deciding which experiences are allowed to remain within your mind after they have ended. As Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. Temporary moments remain temporary. Passing comments remain passing comments. Other people's opinions stop becoming permanent residents within your inner world. The mind becomes lighter because it is no longer carrying unnecessary weight from one day into the next. As that habit grows stronger, you begin experiencing time differently. The present no longer feels crowded by echoes of yesterday, and attention gradually returns to where life has always been unfolding. Not inside old conversations, not inside imagined endings. Right here, in the only moment where peace, clarity, and meaningful action have ever truly existed. There is something quietly fascinating about people who remain calm when everyone else expects a reaction. They do not seem hurried by the need to defend every opinion or explain every decision. They rarely interrupt. They are comfortable allowing silence to exist without treating it as a problem that must immediately be solved. At first, this kind of composure can appear mysterious because it moves against the rhythm of modern life. We are taught to answer quickly, justify ourselves constantly, and protect our image whenever it feels threatened. Yet, calm people seem to follow a different set of priorities. They understand that not every misunderstanding deserves their attention, and not every opinion requires their participation. They conserve something most people spend without hesitation. They conserve their peace. That restraint is often mistaken for indifference, but in reality it grows from a deep understanding that inner stability is too valuable to exchange for every passing disagreement. This realization can feel disappointing at first because it asks you to release something the mind desperately wants to control. Most people spend years trying to manage how they appear in the minds of others. They carefully choose words, replay conversations, and worry endlessly about impressions they cannot actually govern. The Stoics recognized that this effort quietly steals enormous amounts of energy. Your character belongs to you. Another person's opinion does not. Trying to control both at the same time creates a burden no one can successfully carry. Peace begins returning the moment you accept that your responsibility ends with acting according to your principles. What others choose to believe after that belongs to their own judgment, not yours. This does not mean becoming careless about how your actions affect people. Thoughtfulness still matters. Honesty still matters. Taking responsibility for genuine mistakes remains an essential part of wisdom. The difference lies in understanding where responsibility ends. There is a point where further explanation no longer serves truth, but serves anxiety. You continue speaking not because the conversation requires it, but because your own discomfort cannot tolerate being misunderstood. In those moments, you are no longer trying to communicate. You are trying to erase uncertainty. Yet uncertainty is part of every human relationship. No matter how carefully you live, there will always be people who see only fragments of your story. Expecting complete understanding from everyone is asking life for something it has never promised. Calm people seem mysterious because they have quietly accepted this reality. They no longer chase complete approval because they understand it does not exist. Instead, they focus on something far more stable. They ask whether they acted with integrity rather than whether everyone applauded their actions. That shift changes the direction of attention completely. Instead of constantly looking outward for reassurance, they begin looking inward for alignment. Did their actions reflect their values? Did they remain honest even when honesty was uncomfortable? Did they preserve their composure when circumstances invited emotional reaction? These questions create a steadiness that cannot easily be disturbed because their answers do not depend upon changing opinions. There is also a quiet confidence that grows when you stop treating every misunderstanding as an emergency. The mind becomes less crowded because it is no longer rehearsing endless explanations. Conversations end when they end instead of continuing inside your imagination for hours afterward. You discover that being misunderstood is uncomfortable, but it is rarely dangerous. In fact, many of the fears surrounding misunderstanding exist only because pride quietly magnifies them. Pride insists that everyone must recognize your intentions. Wisdom gently reminds you that your life can continue peacefully even when some people never fully understand you. That reminder creates extraordinary freedom because it releases you from a task that was impossible from the beginning. Over time, this discipline changes how others experience your presence. They notice that you do not argue over every opinion. They recognize that you speak thoughtfully instead of impulsively. Your words begin carrying greater weight precisely because they are no longer offered to every passing disagreement. Silence becomes part of your communication rather than an absence of it. You no longer feel pressured to fill every pause or defend every assumption. Instead, you allow reality to unfold before deciding whether your energy is truly needed. That patience often reveals more than immediate reaction ever could. People who sincerely seek understanding remain open to conversation. Those interested only in conflict often lose interest when they realize they cannot easily pull you into it. There comes a quiet turning point in a person's life that almost no one notices from the outside. It is not marked by a dramatic achievement, a major decision, or a sudden change in circumstance. It begins with a different kind of question. For years, the mind automatically asks whether someone deserves an explanation. It searches for the right words to clear up misunderstandings, defend intentions, and preserve a carefully protected image. Every disagreement feels like something that must be resolved. Every false assumption feels like a threat. Every criticism creates the urge to step forward and prove that it is wrong. Then, almost unnoticed, the question changes. Instead of asking whether another person deserves an explanation, you begin asking whether that explanation deserves your attention, your time, and your peace. That small shift seems almost insignificant at first, yet it quietly transforms the way you move through the world. You stop measuring every interaction by whether you successfully changed someone else's opinion and begin measuring it by whether you remained faithful to your own clarity. This new perspective feels unfamiliar because it asks you to release a habit that has been reinforced for most of your life. From childhood, many people are taught to justify themselves constantly. Explain why you made that choice. Explain why you feel that way. Explain why someone misunderstood you. Over time, explanation begins feeling like proof of innocence, as though silence automatically suggests guilt. The mind grows uncomfortable whenever another person holds an inaccurate view because it assumes that misunderstanding must immediately be corrected. Yet life quietly reveals something important. Some people genuinely want understanding, others simply want your participation. They ask questions not to learn, but to continue the argument. They invite explanations only so they can challenge them again. The conversation becomes endless because its purpose was never resolution. It was engagement. Recognizing that difference protects you from investing yourself in exchanges that cannot produce the peace you are hoping to find. The Stoics understood that not every invitation deserves acceptance. They did not believe wisdom required constant defense. Instead, they believed that character revealed itself through consistent action rather than endless explanation. A person who truly lives according to their principles does not need every observer to agree with them before feeling secure. Their confidence grows from alignment between values and behavior, not from applause or approval. This does not mean they avoid difficult conversations or refuse accountability. Quite the opposite. They speak honestly when honesty serves understanding. They accept responsibility when responsibility belongs to them. But they also recognize the moment when additional words stop serving truth and begin serving only anxiety. That awareness allows them to leave conversations with their peace still intact instead of carrying them long after they have ended. One of the greatest sources of unnecessary suffering comes from trying to manage other people's perceptions. It is an impossible responsibility disguised as an achievable goal. Every person views the world through experiences you cannot fully see and beliefs you cannot completely control. Two people can witness the same action and arrive at entirely different conclusions. One sees kindness where another sees weakness. One sees confidence where another sees arrogance. One sees honesty where another sees criticism. If your emotional stability depends upon controlling those interpretations, then your peace will always remain fragile because it rests upon something that was never yours to govern. The moment you understand this deeply, the desire to protect your image begins losing its urgency. You realize that your responsibility has always been to protect your character instead. That distinction changes the way you experience conflict. You no longer enter every disagreement believing your identity is at stake. Instead, you quietly observe whether the conversation is moving toward understanding or simply circling around pride. If genuine dialogue is possible, you participate with openness and respect. If the exchange has become nothing more than a contest of egos, you recognize that continuing often costs more than it could ever return. This recognition is not defeat. It is discernment. Walking away from a conversation that cannot produce wisdom is not avoiding truth. It is refusing to sacrifice your inner stability for an outcome that remains beyond your control. As this habit grows stronger, something subtle begins happening inside your mind. The need to appear right slowly weakens because another desire becomes more important. You begin valuing peace more than victory. This does not make you careless about truth. Instead, it changes your relationship with it. You stop treating truth as something that must always be proven through argument and begin living it through consistent action. There is remarkable confidence in allowing your life to become your explanation. Words remain useful, but they no longer carry the impossible burden of convincing every person you meet. Your actions quietly speak where endless debates once consumed your energy. This shift also changes the conversations you have with yourself. After difficult interactions, the mind becomes less interested in replaying every sentence. It no longer searches obsessively for the perfect response that should have been given. Instead, it asks a simpler question: did I remain true to my principles? If the answer is yes, the conversation ends much sooner. If the answer is no, there is something meaningful to learn without becoming trapped in regret. Reflection replaces rumination. Growth replaces self-defense. You begin understanding that your greatest responsibility is not winning every exchange, but strengthening the person who walks away from it. Over time, this way of living creates a freedom that cannot be measured by outward success alone. Other people's opinions continue changing because that is their nature. Misunderstandings still happen because no human relationship is perfect. Criticism still appears because every life attracts different perspectives. Yet none of these experiences possess the same power they once held. They no longer determine the quality of your inner world because your attention has found a more stable foundation. You are no longer trying to preserve an image that exists inside someone else's mind. You are protecting something far more valuable. You are protecting the quiet freedom that comes from knowing your peace belongs to you, and no explanation is worth surrendering it unless it truly serves what is good, honest, and necessary. Conflict has a remarkable way of exposing the habits we usually keep hidden. During calm moments, almost anyone can appear patient, thoughtful, and reasonable. But when criticism arrives unexpectedly, when someone challenges your beliefs, questions your intentions, or speaks with unnecessary hostility, something deeper begins revealing itself. The first reaction often comes before conscious thought has time to catch up. The heart beats faster, the body grows tense. The mind immediately starts collecting evidence to defend itself. It feels as though your entire identity has suddenly been placed on trial. For many people, this is the moment where awareness disappears and instinct takes control. Every sentence becomes sharper, every response becomes faster. The conversation slowly stops being about understanding and becomes a contest over who will surrender first. Yet there is another possibility hidden inside these moments, one that the Stoics understood with remarkable clarity. Instead of immediately joining the conflict, you begin observing it. Instead of becoming consumed by the argument itself, you become interested in the forces quietly shaping it. This perspective also changes the way you see yourself. You begin noticing that your own reactions are not always caused by another person's words alone. Sometimes they awaken something that was already waiting inside you. A simple disagreement may stir an old fear of rejection. A small criticism may touch an insecurity you believed had already disappeared. An unfair accusation may awaken pride that immediately demands justice. None of these responses make you weak. They simply reveal areas where greater understanding is still possible. The Stoics believed that difficult people often become unexpected teachers because they expose attachments that comfort never reveals. Calm situations rarely test character. Conflict does. It shines light on habits that remain invisible while everything is going well. As this awareness grows, something interesting begins happening. You stop seeing every disagreement as a personal attack and start seeing it as information. The conversation becomes less about protecting yourself and more about understanding the dynamics unfolding between two human minds. One person may be speaking from fear while believing they are speaking from reason. Another may be reacting from wounded pride without realizing it. You may even recognize the same tendencies within yourself. This realization does not make conflict enjoyable, but it makes it far more understandable. The emotional intensity begins losing some of its power because curiosity quietly replaces defensiveness. It is difficult to remain consumed by anger while sincerely trying to understand what lies beneath it. Many arguments continue far longer than necessary because neither person pauses long enough to observe what is actually driving the exchange. Each side focuses entirely on the words while ignoring the emotions generating them. One person insists on being right, the other insists on being understood. Both believe they are discussing facts, yet the real conversation revolves around something much deeper. It revolves around the universal desire to feel respected, valued, and safe. Once those deeper needs become visible, many disagreements begin looking very different. You realize that winning the argument may never resolve the underlying problem, because the argument was only the surface expression of something else entirely. Responding only to the surface often guarantees that the deeper issue remains untouched. The Stoics often reminded themselves that every person is carrying an inner struggle that remains largely invisible. Remembering this changes the atmosphere of conflict. Compassion quietly enters where resentment once dominated. You become less interested in defeating someone and more interested in preserving your own clarity. Even when firm boundaries are necessary, they can be established without hatred. Even when disagreement remains unresolved, your peace does not have to disappear alongside it. You discover that another person's behavior may explain why they acted as they did, but it never has to dictate the quality of your own response. Gradually, conversations stop feeling like competitions that determine your worth. They become opportunities to practice observation, patience, and self-command. Every difficult interaction becomes another reminder that the greatest challenge is rarely convincing someone else. It is remaining faithful to your own principles while emotions invite you elsewhere. This quiet shift changes more than the outcome of individual conversations. It changes the way you move through life itself. The world becomes less divided into enemies and allies, and more filled with people responding to their own unseen struggles. That understanding creates a calm strength that cannot be manufactured through clever words or stronger arguments. It grows naturally from seeing beneath appearances and refusing to let temporary conflict distract you from the deeper work of mastering your own mind. There is a quiet confidence that develops when you no longer depend upon constant agreement. It is not loud. It does not demand attention. In fact, many people overlook it because it lacks the urgency that often accompanies insecurity. Someone who trusts their own principles does not feel compelled to prove them every few minutes. They speak when speaking is useful. They remain silent when silence serves better. They do not argue simply because disagreement exists, nor do they retreat simply because someone disapproves. Their steadiness becomes noticeable precisely because it is uncommon. In a world where many people react immediately to every challenge, calm begins standing out without ever trying to. Others sense that this person is not easily pushed from one emotional state to another, and that consistency naturally inspires trust. Ironically, this is often when genuine influence begins appearing. People become more willing to listen because they no longer sense desperation beneath your words. There is no hidden demand that they must agree before you feel secure. Conversations become invitations rather than contests. Others feel less pressure to defend themselves because they are no longer responding to someone trying to force an outcome. Instead, they encounter a person whose confidence exists independently of the conversation's result. That quiet independence creates space for honesty. It allows ideas to be considered instead of resisted. Influence grows not through pressure, but through the absence of it. The less attached you become to controlling every response, the more freely others are able to think for themselves. The Stoics understood that trying to control another person's judgment is ultimately a struggle against reality itself. Every individual interprets life through different experiences, different fears, and different hopes. No amount of persuasion can completely overcome that complexity. Accepting this truth does not weaken your ability to communicate, it strengthens it. You stop speaking with the impossible goal of controlling another mind and begin speaking simply because honesty deserves expression. Once those words are offered sincerely, you allow the outcome to unfold without clinging to it. That release protects your peace because your emotional well-being no longer depends upon whether your ideas receive immediate acceptance. You have fulfilled your responsibility. Everything beyond that belongs to someone else's freedom. This shift also changes the way you experience rejection. Instead of interpreting disagreement as evidence that something is wrong with you, you begin recognizing that different minds naturally reach different conclusions. Sometimes another person rejects an idea because they misunderstand it. Sometimes they reject it because it conflicts with beliefs they have carried for years. Sometimes they reject it simply because they are not ready to hear it. None of those possibilities require you to abandon your own clarity. As Epictetus wisely observed, if anyone tells you that a certain person speaks ill of you, do not make excuses about what is said of you, but answer, "He was ignorant of my other faults, else he would not have mentioned these alone." They simply remind you that influence cannot be forced. Seeds grow only when the ground is ready, and wisdom often works the same way. Your task is not to control when understanding appears. Your task is to remain truthful, regardless of how quickly it is recognized. As this perspective becomes part of your everyday life, something deeper begins taking root. You become increasingly difficult to manipulate because your emotions are no longer easily purchased through praise or criticism. Compliments remain pleasant, but they do not define you. Disapproval remains uncomfortable, but it does not direct you. Decisions arise from careful reflection rather than the shifting moods of those around you. That quiet independence creates a presence that people instinctively respect because it cannot be bought with approval or shaken by disagreement. In the end, the greatest influence is rarely found in convincing everyone to think like you. It is found in living with such steady integrity that your example speaks long after the conversation has ended, reminding others that genuine strength has never required constant validation to prove it exists. Real change rarely arrives in dramatic moments. Most people expect transformation to feel immediate, as though one powerful realization will permanently alter the way they think, react, and live. They imagine reading the right book, hearing the perfect advice, or making one firm decision that suddenly frees them from years of emotional habits. Reality moves much more quietly than that. The mind is shaped through repetition, not revelation. Every belief you now carry, every automatic reaction, every familiar pattern was built one moment at a time. You did not wake up one morning suddenly believing that every criticism demanded an answer, or that every disagreement threatened your sense of worth. Those habits were formed gradually through countless experiences, repeated until they felt like part of your personality. The encouraging truth is that what repetition creates, repetition can also reshape. The same mind that learned to react automatically can learn to respond with intention. The same attention that wandered endlessly toward conflict can slowly become disciplined enough to remain where it truly belongs. The Stoics understood this better than most. They never believed wisdom was something achieved once and then possessed forever. They treated it as a lifelong practice requiring continual attention. Every day presented another opportunity to strengthen judgment, patience, and self-command. They expected setbacks because they understood the nature of the human mind. Habits do not disappear simply because they have been recognized. They fade because they are repeatedly replaced with better ones. Each moment of awareness interrupts a familiar pattern. Each deliberate pause becomes another quiet lesson, teaching the mind that immediate reaction is no longer necessary. Gradually, what once required enormous effort begins feeling increasingly natural. Not because life becomes easier, but because your responses become steadier. Think about how habits are formed in every other area of life. A musician does not master an instrument after one practice session. A skilled craftsman does not develop precision after completing a single project. Strength is built through repeated movements that often seem ordinary while they are taking place. Emotional discipline follows the same principle. Every time you resist the urge to answer impulsively, you strengthen patience. Every time you choose reflection instead of resentment, you strengthen clarity. Every time you allow another person's frustration to remain with them instead of carrying it yourself, you strengthen freedom. None of these individual moments appear extraordinary, yet together they quietly reshape the architecture of your mind. The person you become tomorrow is largely determined by the responses you practice today. There will still be days when old patterns return. A harsh criticism may awaken familiar defensiveness. An unexpected disappointment may revive habits you believed were already behind you. This does not erase your progress. It simply reminds you that growth is rarely linear. The mind naturally returns to what it has practiced most often, especially during moments of stress. Instead of becoming discouraged, those moments become invitations to practice once again. You notice the reaction without condemning yourself for experiencing it. You acknowledge the emotion without allowing it to define the outcome. Each return to awareness strengthens confidence because it reminds you that you are no longer completely governed by impulse. Even when old habits appear, they no longer possess unquestioned authority over your choices. This gradual process also changes the way you speak to yourself. Instead of demanding perfection, you begin appreciating consistency. The inner conversation becomes gentler but more honest. You stop expecting every difficult situation to unfold flawlessly and begin recognizing the quiet victories that once escaped your attention. Perhaps you ended an argument sooner than you would have months ago. Perhaps you let an unnecessary comment pass without carrying it into the evening. Perhaps you noticed anger before it reached your words. These moments deserve recognition because they represent genuine movement. Character is not built only through dramatic acts of courage. It is built through repeated decisions that nobody else may ever notice. Quiet discipline often produces the deepest transformation precisely because it develops away from applause. As this practice continues, something remarkable begins happening almost without your awareness. Situations that once felt impossible to manage become surprisingly ordinary. The criticism that once occupied your thoughts for days loses its emotional weight by the afternoon. The disagreement that previously demanded endless explanation no longer feels worthy of your attention. You do not force yourself to remain calm. Calm simply begins appearing more naturally because the habit of reacting has slowly weakened. Your mind learns that peace was never dependent upon changing another person's opinion. It was dependent upon changing the relationship you maintained with your own thoughts. That realization becomes increasingly stable with every experience confirming it. Eventually, you stop viewing discipline as something you perform only during difficult moments. It quietly becomes part of the way you live. Patience no longer feels like resistance. Reflection no longer feels slow. Protecting your attention no longer feels like sacrifice. It feels natural because your priorities have changed. You understand that every unnecessary argument avoided preserves energy for something more meaningful. Every thoughtful pause strengthens trust in your own judgment. Every decision to remain grounded reminds you that your peace has never belonged to the opinions surrounding you. It has always grown from the quiet choices made within you, one moment at a time, repeated patiently, until they become the person you were gradually becoming all along. Eventually, something begins happening that you never expected. The world itself does not become quieter. People do not suddenly become kinder. Criticism does not disappear. Disappointments continue arriving without warning. Life remains as unpredictable as it has always been, yet your experience of it changes in ways that are almost difficult to describe. The rude comment that once followed you throughout the entire day now fades within minutes. The disagreement that would have occupied your thoughts all evening quietly dissolves before you even arrive home. A stranger's opinion no longer feels like something that must be examined from every possible angle. At first, this change seems so subtle that you barely notice it. Then one day you realize an entire week has passed without mentally reliving a conversation that once would have consumed your attention. Nothing outside has become easier. Something inside has become steadier. This transformation surprises many people because they assume peace arrives only after external problems disappear. They imagine that calm is the reward for finally creating the perfect life, finding the perfect relationships, or eliminating every difficult person from their surroundings. The Stoics understood the opposite. They believed that waiting for the world to become peaceful before experiencing peace within yourself is a lifelong disappointment. The world has always been uncertain. It has always contained misunderstanding, conflict, and unexpected change. The real question is not whether those things will continue existing. They will. The deeper question is whether they deserve the same authority over your mind that you once gave them. That question quietly changes everything because it shifts responsibility back into your own hands. Instead of demanding a different world, you begin cultivating a different relationship with the world that already exists. Much of human suffering comes from assigning enormous importance to experiences that deserve very little of it. A careless remark becomes evidence that something is wrong with you. A disagreement becomes proof that you have failed. An unexpected setback quietly grows into a story about the future rather than remaining a single moment in the present. The mind naturally magnifies whatever receives repeated attention. Every return to the same memory strengthens its emotional weight. Every unnecessary rehearsal convinces you that the event must have been significant simply because you keep thinking about it. Yet significance is not determined by repetition. It is determined by reality. Many of the things that once seemed impossible to ignore begin looking surprisingly small once you stop feeding them the attention that kept them alive. Think about the conversations that once occupied your thoughts for days. At the time, they appeared overwhelmingly important. You searched for better responses. You imagined different endings. You convinced yourself that if only you had said one more sentence, everything would have changed. Looking back months or years later, many of those moments seem almost insignificant. The emotional weight they once carried has disappeared, not because the memory vanished, but because your perspective became larger than the event itself. The same process begins happening much sooner once you train your attention differently. Instead of waiting years to realize a conflict was never worth carrying, you begin recognizing that truth while the experience is still fresh. That awareness saves an extraordinary amount of emotional energy because you no longer spend days fighting battles that ended within minutes. The Stoics often reminded themselves that the mind behaves much like a fire. Whatever you continue feeding grows stronger. Whatever you stop feeding gradually fades. Anger survives through repeated justification. Fear survives through repeated prediction. Resentment survives through repeated remembrance. None of these emotions require constant external events to remain alive. They continue because the mind unknowingly provides fresh fuel through attention. Once that fuel becomes limited, something remarkable begins happening. The emotions themselves lose much of their intensity. They may still appear briefly, but they no longer establish permanent residence. They pass through your awareness instead of settling there. The mind becomes quieter, not because it has stopped producing thoughts, but because it has stopped treating every thought as equally important. There is another unexpected benefit to this change. As unnecessary mental noise begins fading, ordinary moments become easier to appreciate. Conversations receive your full attention because they are no longer interrupted by memories from yesterday's argument. A walk becomes simply a walk instead of another opportunity to rehearse old frustrations. Meals become more enjoyable because your mind is no longer sitting somewhere else while your body goes through familiar routines. Presence returns naturally when attention is no longer constantly borrowed by things that no longer deserve it. Many people spend years searching for greater happiness while overlooking the simple truth that peace often begins with removing unnecessary mental burdens rather than adding new pleasures. This does not mean difficult experiences suddenly lose all emotional impact. There will always be moments that deserve careful reflection. Grief deserves space. Genuine mistakes deserve honest examination. Important relationships deserve thoughtful conversations. The difference is that wisdom gradually learns to separate meaningful reflection from unnecessary rumination. One helps you grow, the other quietly keeps you trapped. Learning that distinction becomes one of the most valuable forms of discernment you can develop because it protects your attention without encouraging avoidance. You still face reality honestly. You simply stop carrying reality far beyond the point where it remains useful. Over time, this new way of living begins influencing every part of your character. Patience grows because urgency no longer controls every decision. Confidence grows because your peace no longer depends upon changing another person's opinion. Gratitude becomes easier because your attention is no longer consumed by endless dissatisfaction. Even your relationships begin changing because you arrive with a calmer presence instead of accumulated frustration from conversations that should have ended long ago. People notice that you are easier to talk to, not because you have become passive, but because your mind is no longer constantly preparing for conflict. You listen more completely. You react less impulsively. Your responses come from clarity instead of habit. Perhaps the greatest surprise is realizing that the world itself never became less noisy. Social media continues demanding attention. Opinions continue filling every corner of daily life. Unexpected criticism still appears without invitation. None of that has disappeared. What disappeared was the belief that every piece of noise deserved a place inside your mind. That single change alters your entire experience of life. The volume of the world remains the same, yet your inner world becomes remarkably quiet because you have finally learned that attention is not something the world has the right to take. It is something only you can choose to give, and that choice quietly shapes every day that follows. From that point, the journey becomes even more personal because you begin discovering that not every disturbance comes from the outside world. For a long time, it seemed as though difficult people, unfair situations, and unexpected disappointments were the primary sources of inner conflict. As your reactions become calmer, however, another truth slowly reveals itself. Some of the loudest battles no longer involve another person at all. They unfold entirely within your own mind. A memory returns without invitation. Regret quietly replays an old decision. Anxiety begins constructing futures that have not happened. Self-criticism searches for flaws in everything you have done. Suddenly you realize that silence around you does not always create silence within you. The mind has become remarkably talented at producing its own distractions, and unlike the noise of the outside world, these thoughts seem to speak with your own voice. That is precisely what makes them so convincing. They do not feel like passing mental events. They feel like undeniable truths that demand your immediate attention. This is where many people become trapped without realizing it. They spend years learning how to avoid unnecessary arguments with others while continuing to argue endlessly with themselves. The conversation simply changes location. Instead of defending yourself against another person's criticism, you begin defending yourself against your own. Instead of replaying yesterday's disagreement with someone else, you replay yesterday's disappointment with yourself. The pattern remains remarkably similar. Thoughts appear, emotions follow. The mind begins searching for certainty where none exists. Before long, a single idea has expanded into an entire emotional landscape, and nothing outside has actually changed. Your body may be sitting peacefully in a quiet room, yet your inner world feels crowded by conversations that exist nowhere except inside your imagination. The Stoics recognized that mastering external reactions is only the beginning. The deeper challenge lies in learning that your own thoughts deserve observation before they deserve belief. Regret is one of the mind's favorite ways of holding attention captive. It whispers that if only you had made a different choice, spoken different words, or recognized something sooner, life would now be entirely different. At first, this reflection seems useful because learning from the past is part of wisdom. But there is an important difference between learning and lingering. Reflection asks what can be understood. Rumination asks the same question repeatedly even after the answer has already been found. The mind returns to familiar mistakes not because new insight is waiting there, but because emotional habits often disguise themselves as problem-solving. It convinces you that another hour of thinking will somehow rewrite yesterday, yet no amount of mental repetition changes a decision that already belongs to history. The only thing it changes is your ability to fully experience the present moment. Anxiety follows a similar path, except it travels in the opposite direction. Instead of living in memories, it lives inside possibilities. It creates conversations that have not happened, failures that have not occurred, and disappointments that exist only in imagination. The remarkable part is that the body often reacts as though those imagined futures are already unfolding. Your heartbeat changes, your breathing becomes shallow. Muscles tighten in preparation for dangers that remain entirely hypothetical. The mind does not always distinguish clearly between vivid imagination and immediate reality. Left unchecked, it begins treating every uncertain future as though it were a confirmed outcome. Days become consumed by preparing for events that never arrive, while opportunities already present quietly pass unnoticed. Self-criticism often feels even more persuasive because it speaks with the familiar voice of your own identity. It tells you that you are simply being honest with yourself, when in reality it often repeats judgments far harsher than you would ever direct toward another person. One mistake becomes evidence of failure. One weakness becomes proof that you will never improve. One setback becomes a prediction about the rest of your life. The Stoics never suggested ignoring personal flaws. They believed honest self-examination was essential, but they also understood that wisdom requires fairness. A clear mind evaluates mistakes without turning them into permanent definitions. It corrects behavior without attacking identity. There is a profound difference between saying, "That decision was unwise," and believing, "I am incapable of wisdom." One encourages growth, the other quietly destroys it. This is why learning to observe your own thoughts becomes one of the most important disciplines you can develop. Just as another person's anger does not automatically deserve your reaction, neither does every thought produced by your own mind. Thoughts arise continuously. Some are helpful, some are distorted by fear, pride, habit, or exhaustion. The mere appearance of a thought does not make it accurate, just as the appearance of a cloud does not change the nature of the sky behind it. Once you begin recognizing this, your relationship with your own mind gradually changes. Instead of immediately following every thought wherever it leads, you pause. You notice it. You allow it to exist without assuming it deserves complete authority over your emotions or your actions. At first, this practice feels unfamiliar because the mind has spent years reacting automatically to itself. Every anxious prediction demanded attention. Every regret invited another replay. Every critical thought felt like an objective fact. Creating distance from those patterns requires patience. but each moment of awareness weakens their influence. You discover that many thoughts disappear naturally when they are no longer constantly fed with attention. They arrive, remain briefly, and quietly pass on. The struggle was never the thought itself. The struggle came from believing you had to engage with every one of them. That realization brings an unexpected sense of relief, because it reminds you that peace does not require controlling every thought. It requires choosing which thoughts deserve your continued attention. As this understanding grows deeper, your inner world begins changing in the same way your outer world once did. Just as criticism from others gradually lost its power to disturb you, unnecessary thoughts begin losing their authority as well. The mind becomes less crowded because it is no longer chasing every fear into the future or every regret into the past. There is more room for clarity, more room for gratitude, and more room for the quiet awareness that life is unfolding only in this present moment. You realize that the greatest freedom was never found in controlling circumstances, silencing other people, or eliminating uncertainty. It was found in learning that even within your own mind, you still possess the ability to choose what deserves your attention, and that choice quietly becomes one of the most powerful forms of self-mastery a person can ever achieve. Once you begin observing your thoughts instead of immediately obeying them, something remarkable starts unfolding within you. The world outside may look exactly the same, yet your experience of it becomes entirely different. Thoughts still appear, emotions still rise and fall, uncertainty still visits from time to time, but they no longer arrive with the same authority they once possessed. There is now a quiet distance between the one who notices the thought and the thought itself. That distance is subtle, almost impossible to describe at first, yet it changes everything. Before, every idea that entered your mind seemed to demand belief. Every fear sounded like a warning. Every doubt felt like a fact. Now you begin recognizing that the mind produces countless thoughts throughout the day, many of which contradict one another. If every thought represented reality, then reality itself would constantly change from one minute to the next. The Stoics understood that wisdom begins when you stop identifying completely with every movement of the mind and start recognizing that awareness itself is steadier than whatever passes through it. This realization feels liberating because it quietly removes an invisible burden you may have carried for years. You no longer feel responsible for controlling every thought that appears. Instead, you become responsible only for how you respond to those thoughts. That distinction is profound. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." It means an anxious prediction can exist without determining your future. A fearful idea can arise without becoming your decision. A memory can return without taking possession of your entire day. The mind continues producing its endless stream of impressions, but your relationship with those impressions begins changing. You stop treating them like orders that must be followed and start treating them like visitors that may or may not deserve to stay. Some bring valuable insight. Others simply arrive carrying old habits dressed as urgent truths. Learning the difference becomes one of the most important forms of inner discipline. This becomes especially clear during periods of uncertainty. The mind naturally dislikes unanswered questions, so it rushes to create answers of its own. When certainty cannot be found, imagination eagerly fills the empty space. It predicts rejection before anyone has spoken. It anticipates failure before any attempt has been made. It prepares for disappointment before life has even unfolded. These imagined futures often feel so vivid that the body reacts as though they are already happening. Yet if you pause long enough to observe the process, something becomes obvious. Most of these predictions never become reality. They were never facts. They were possibilities interpreted through fear. Once you recognize this pattern repeatedly, the mind gradually loses its habit of presenting every anxious thought as though it were an unavoidable future. The same principle applies to emotions. Feeling something intensely does not automatically make it permanent or accurate. Anger may convince you that a relationship is beyond repair. Sadness may insist that joy will never return. Fear may whisper that you are incapable of handling what lies ahead. These emotions deserve acknowledgement because they are genuine experiences, but they do not deserve unquestioned authority. They are temporary conditions, not permanent identities. The Stoics never encouraged denying emotion. They encouraged placing emotion beside reason rather than beneath it. Feelings become part of the conversation instead of becoming the only voice allowed to speak. This balance creates remarkable stability because your decisions no longer change direction every time your emotional weather changes. As this understanding deepens, an entirely different kind of confidence begins developing. It is not the confidence that comes from believing nothing difficult will ever happen. It is the confidence that comes from trusting your ability to remain present, regardless of what thoughts or emotions appear. You realize that discomfort can exist without controlling your actions. Uncertainty can remain unresolved without forcing immediate conclusions. Fear can accompany you without becoming your guide. This quiet trust becomes stronger each time you experience a difficult thought without immediately surrendering to it. Every moment of observation reminds you that awareness is larger than whatever passes through it. The mind may become noisy, but awareness itself remains remarkably calm beneath that noise. There is something deeply reassuring about recognizing that thoughts are temporary by nature. No matter how convincing they seem, they are always changing. Yesterday's worries become today's forgotten concerns. Last month's fears become stories you barely remember. Even the thoughts that once seemed impossible to escape eventually faded because they were never designed to remain forever. Realizing this changes your relationship with difficult moments. Instead of desperately trying to eliminate uncomfortable thoughts, you become willing to let them move through your awareness at their own pace. Resistance softens. Patience grows. The struggle decreases because you are no longer fighting the existence of the thought itself. You are simply refusing to build your identity around it. Over time, this quiet separation between awareness and thought reshapes the entire landscape of your inner life. Decisions become clearer because they arise from reflection instead of mental urgency. Peace becomes more consistent because it is no longer dependent upon the disappearance of every anxious idea. You stop waiting for a perfectly silent mind before feeling grounded. Instead, you discover that true steadiness comes from recognizing that you are not every thought you think, nor every feeling you experience. You are the one capable of witnessing both without losing yourself inside them. That understanding becomes one of the strongest foundations upon which lasting emotional resilience can quietly grow, allowing you to move through life with greater clarity, greater patience, and a freedom that no passing thought can easily take away. One of the first things to disappear is the constant desire to prove yourself. Earlier in life, every criticism felt like a challenge. Every disagreement became an opportunity to demonstrate intelligence, defend your choices, or protect your reputation. There was always another explanation waiting to be given, another argument waiting to be won, another misunderstanding waiting to be corrected. It was exhausting, though you may not have recognized it at the time because it had become normal. As your perspective changes, proving yourself begins feeling strangely unnecessary. Not because your principles matter less, but because they matter more. You realize that genuine character does not become stronger every time it is defended. It becomes stronger every time it is lived. The opinions of others may continue changing from one day to the next, but your commitment to your own values no longer needs their permission to remain steady. This creates space that previously did not exist. Attention once consumed by emotional noise slowly becomes available again. At first, that empty space can feel unfamiliar because the mind has grown accustomed to constant stimulation. There is no argument to replay, no criticism demanding another response, no endless search for validation occupying every quiet moment. What remains is silence, and within that silence, something valuable begins taking root. You find yourself reading with greater focus because your thoughts are no longer scattered across unfinished conversations. You become more creative because your imagination is no longer trapped inside yesterday's conflicts. Learning becomes enjoyable again because your attention is finally free enough to remain with the ideas in front of you instead of drifting toward unnecessary distractions. The same mind that once felt crowded now begins feeling spacious. This shift also changes the way you spend time when no one else is watching. There is less interest in appearances and more interest in substance. Instead of asking how something will make you look, you begin asking how it will shape the person you're becoming. Small daily habits suddenly carry greater meaning because they are no longer performed for recognition. Reading a few pages of a thoughtful book, taking time to reflect before reacting, practicing patience during ordinary moments that nobody else notices. These quiet disciplines begin feeling deeply satisfying because they strengthen something that cannot be measured through public approval. The Stoics believed that the quality of a person's inner life determines the quality of every outward action. When that inner foundation becomes stronger, everything built upon it naturally becomes steadier as well. Another unexpected benefit begins appearing in your relationships. Because you no longer spend so much energy seeking approval, your interactions become more genuine. You listen without secretly preparing your defense. You speak because something meaningful needs to be said rather than because silence feels uncomfortable. You appreciate people for who they are instead of measuring every conversation by whether they validate your identity. This quiet confidence creates healthier connections because it removes the invisible pressure that often accompanies insecurity. Others sense that your presence is no longer asking anything from them. It is simply offering honesty, attention, and respect. Ironically, this often strengthens relationships far more than years spent trying to earn acceptance ever could. People often misunderstand emotional restraint because they assume it creates distance between people. They imagine that someone who has learned not to react impulsively must also become cold, detached, or emotionally unavailable. From the outside, calm can sometimes resemble indifference, especially in a world where strong emotions are often mistaken for sincerity. If someone does not immediately defend themselves, they are assumed to be weak. If they do not argue passionately, they are assumed not to care. If they remain composed while others become emotional, they are often described as disconnected. Yet the truth is almost the complete opposite. The person who has learned to govern their reactions is usually far more connected to reality than the person constantly carried away by every passing emotion. They are not feeling less, they are simply allowing those feelings to exist without letting them overwhelm their ability to see clearly. The Stoics never sought to eliminate human connection. They sought to remove the unnecessary emotional noise that prevents genuine connection from taking place in the first place. This also changes the way disagreements unfold. Conflict no longer feels like a struggle that must produce winners and losers. Instead, it becomes an opportunity to understand why two different perspectives developed in the first place. That does not mean agreement will always follow. People will continue holding different beliefs, making different choices, and seeing the world through different experiences. The difference is that disagreement no longer destroys connection as easily because it is no longer driven by the desperate need to protect the ego. You stop viewing another person's opinion as a threat to your identity. As a result, you become curious instead of defensive. Curiosity softens conversations that pride often hardens. Even when no agreement is reached, respect remains possible because understanding has replaced emotional competition. There is another subtle change that gradually appears. You become more available to the people who truly matter because your emotional energy is no longer scattered across countless unnecessary conflicts. Think about how often meaningful conversations are interrupted by thoughts that have nothing to do with the person sitting in front of you. Yesterday's argument, tomorrow's worry, an unresolved frustration from earlier in the day. Physically, you are present, but mentally you are somewhere else. The person across from you senses this, even if neither of you mentions it. True presence cannot exist when attention is divided. As you become more disciplined with your own mind, however, you begin arriving fully in the moments that deserve you. Family conversations become richer, friendships become more genuine, even brief interactions with strangers carry greater warmth because you are no longer viewing every encounter through the filter of accumulated emotional tension. The Stoics believed that every relationship is strengthened when people stop demanding from one another what only they can provide for themselves. Many conflicts begin because individuals expect another person to supply constant reassurance, endless validation, or permanent certainty. These expectations create pressure that no relationship can sustain forever. Inner steadiness changes this dynamic completely. Instead of approaching others with hidden emotional demands, you begin meeting them from a place of quiet completeness. You still appreciate love, support, and encouragement, but your peace no longer depends entirely upon receiving them every moment. This allows affection to become freely given instead of silently negotiated. Relationships become healthier because they are no longer carrying the impossible responsibility of repairing every inner insecurity. Over time, the fear of becoming emotionally distant quietly disappears because you experience the opposite happening within your own life. You notice yourself becoming more attentive, more patient, and more capable of appreciating simple moments that once passed unnoticed. Conversations become less about proving and more about connecting. Listening becomes an act of generosity instead of merely waiting for your turn to speak. Relationships become places where honesty feels safe rather than where every disagreement threatens closeness. None of this happens because other people suddenly become perfect. It happens because your own inner world has become calm enough to welcome others without constantly filtering them through fear, pride, or insecurity. In learning to govern yourself, you discover that restraint does not separate you from humanity. It allows you to experience it more fully, with greater clarity, deeper understanding, and a presence that quietly becomes one of the greatest gifts you can offer another person. One of the quietest changes that comes with inner discipline is the way you begin interpreting difficult experiences. The events themselves do not become easier. Failure still disappoints. Criticism still stings. Rejection still carries a sense of loss. Being human means those moments will always affect you in some way. The difference is that they no longer define the story you tell yourself afterward. There was a time when one setback seemed capable of rewriting your entire identity. A single mistake became proof that you were incapable. One criticism felt like confirmation that you would never be enough. One rejection convinced you that something essential was missing within you. Those conclusions always felt convincing, because emotion has a remarkable ability to transform temporary experiences into permanent beliefs. As Epictetus reminded his students, it is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them. The Stoics warned against this habit because they understood that circumstances may reveal a moment in your life, but they never possess the authority to determine your worth unless you quietly grant them that power. Failure often becomes painful, not because of the event itself, but because of the meaning attached to it. Two people can experience the same disappointment and leave with completely different futures. One sees the setback as evidence that they should stop trying. The other sees it as evidence that another lesson has appeared. The circumstances are nearly identical, yet the interpretation changes everything that follows. The mind is constantly creating stories to explain what happens, and those stories quietly shape future decisions more than the original event ever could. If every unsuccessful attempt becomes proof of personal inadequacy, Eventually, you begin avoiding challenges altogether, not because you lack ability, but because protecting your identity starts feeling more important than discovering your potential. Growth slowly disappears beneath the weight of self-protection. The Stoics approached failure with a very different perspective. They believed that external outcomes deserve examination, but not worship. Success can teach. Failure can teach. Neither one possesses the right to define your character on its own. What matters far more is how you respond after the outcome has already been decided. Did you act according to your principles? Did you make the best decision you could with the understanding you had at the time? Did you remain willing to learn instead of becoming imprisoned by regret? These questions shift attention away from circumstances you can no longer change and toward the qualities you continue shaping every day. Character grows through repeated responses, not isolated outcomes. A single failure says remarkably little about the person you are becoming unless you decide it represents the final chapter of your story. Criticism follows a similar pattern. For many years, criticism may have felt like a verdict rather than an observation. One negative opinion carried more emotional weight than 10 positive ones. The mind replayed every critical sentence while quietly ignoring encouragement that deserved equal attention. This happened because criticism appeared to threaten identity itself. If someone pointed out a weakness, it felt as though they were describing your entire value rather than one small aspect of your behavior. Emotional discipline slowly changes this relationship. Instead of immediately asking whether criticism hurts, you begin asking whether it is useful. Some criticism contains valuable truth wrapped in uncomfortable words. Other criticism reflects another person's frustration, misunderstanding, or personal bias. Learning to distinguish between those two possibilities becomes one of the most practical forms of wisdom. You accept what helps you grow and quietly release what serves no meaningful purpose. As this perspective becomes part of the way you live, courage quietly changes as well. You become more willing to attempt meaningful things because failure no longer threatens the foundation of who you are. Honest feedback becomes easier to receive because criticism is no longer confused with condemnation. Rejection becomes easier to survive because your value no longer rises and falls with someone else's decision. Life remains uncertain, and that uncertainty never fully disappears. Yet the fear surrounding it gradually loses its grip because you have discovered something more stable than success, praise, or acceptance. You have learned that every experience, no matter how pleasant or painful, is temporary. It passes through your life carrying lessons, opportunities, and moments of growth, but it never possesses the authority to define you unless you quietly choose to surrender that authority yourself. Little by little, your relationship with life begins changing in ways that are almost impossible to notice from one day to the next. The world still moves quickly. News continues demanding urgency. Opinions continue arriving without invitation. Unexpected problems still interrupt carefully made plans. Yet something within you no longer feels compelled to match that pace. There was a time when every inconvenience seemed to require an immediate conclusion. A delayed reply meant something was wrong. A small setback became evidence that everything was falling apart. An uncertain situation demanded instant answers, even when none were available. The mind rushed ahead of reality, filling every empty space with assumptions that felt convincing simply because they appeared first. As your discipline deepens, that urgency slowly begins losing its influence. You no longer believe every unanswered question requires an immediate explanation. You become willing to let life reveal itself before deciding what it truly means. Think about how many fears have disappeared simply because reality chose a different path than your imagination predicted. There were moments when you felt certain something terrible was about to happen. You prepared yourself emotionally for disappointment. You replayed possible outcomes over and over until they felt almost inevitable. Then life unfolded differently. The conversation went better than expected. The opportunity arrived unexpectedly. The problem resolved itself without requiring the endless mental effort you invested preparing for it. Looking back, you realize the greatest source of suffering was not the event itself, but the certainty with which the mind believed its own predictions. It treated possibilities as facts and imagination as evidence. That habit quietly steals enormous amounts of peace because it forces you to experience painful futures long before you know whether they will ever exist. Patience interrupts that pattern in a remarkably simple way. It reminds you that not knowing is not the same as danger. Uncertainty often feels uncomfortable because the mind naturally prefers clear answers, even if those answers are negative. It would rather believe the worst than admit it does not yet know what will happen. Yet wisdom grows strongest inside that very space. Instead of rushing to eliminate uncertainty with fearful conclusions, you begin allowing it to remain unresolved. You acknowledge that the future has not yet arrived and therefore cannot honestly be judged. This quiet restraint feels almost unnatural in the beginning, but with practice it becomes one of the greatest sources of stability you can develop. The need to predict every outcome slowly gives way to the willingness to meet reality as it actually appears, rather than as fear imagines it. The Stoics understood that perspective depends upon time as much as thought. They knew that emotional intensity often narrows perception. When anger appears, everything seems offensive. When fear appears, everything seems threatening. When disappointment appears, everything seems hopeless. Strong emotion temporarily shrinks the horizon until one moment feels large enough to define an entire life. Patience gently widens that horizon again. It reminds you that today's experience exists within a much larger story that has not yet finished unfolding. One difficult morning cannot predict an entire year. One painful conversation cannot determine every future relationship. One setback cannot reveal the limits of your potential. Time often softens conclusions that emotion tried to make permanent. As you practice waiting before reaching conclusions, your mind gradually becomes more trustworthy. You stop believing the first interpretation that appears. Instead, you allow understanding to develop naturally. You gather more information. You observe your own reactions. You notice how emotions influence perception before assuming perception reflects reality. This process does not make you passive. It makes you deliberate. There is an important difference between refusing to act and refusing to act impulsively. One avoids responsibility. The other honors it. Decisions made from clarity often appear slower to those watching from the outside, yet they frequently prevent countless unnecessary problems that hurried reactions create. Another quiet benefit begins emerging from this way of living. Ordinary disappointments lose much of their ability to overwhelm you because they are no longer immediately interpreted as permanent truths. A setback becomes one chapter rather than the entire story. A misunderstanding becomes something to clarify instead of something to fear. Even uncertainty begins feeling different. Instead of experiencing it as an empty space demanding immediate answers, you begin recognizing it as the place where possibilities still exist. As long as the future remains unwritten, hope remains just as reasonable as fear. This realization changes the emotional atmosphere of daily life because you stop allowing imagination to consistently choose the darkest interpretation before evidence has spoken. Gradually, people begin noticing something different about your presence, even if they cannot explain it. While others hurry toward conclusions, you remain steady. While opinions shift with every new emotion, your judgment develops more carefully. You are not slow because you lack confidence. You are patient because you understand the cost of unnecessary certainty. That patience becomes a quiet form of strength. It protects you from reacting to appearances that later prove misleading. It allows wisdom to arrive before action. Most importantly, it reminds you that life unfolds according to its own rhythm, not according to the urgency created by an anxious mind. In accepting that rhythm instead of resisting it, you discover a perspective that remains calm even when circumstances are still uncertain, and that quiet clarity becomes one of the greatest forms of freedom a person can carry through an unpredictable world. Over time, something interesting begins happening that has very little to do with changing other people and everything to do with changing yourself. The world starts responding differently, not because you asked it to, but because you are no longer participating in the same patterns that once defined your interactions. People who expected immediate reactions begin encountering patience instead. Those who relied on provoking emotion discover that the familiar strategy no longer produces the same result. Conversations that once spiraled into unnecessary conflict now end much sooner because there is no longer another person feeding the emotional momentum. This shift rarely requires dramatic speeches or carefully announced boundaries. It happens quietly through consistency. The Stoics understood that the strongest boundaries are often the ones expressed through repeated behavior rather than repeated explanation. When your actions become predictable in wisdom instead of predictable in reaction, people naturally begin adjusting the way they approach you. Most individuals spend years unknowingly teaching others how to treat them. Every unnecessary explanation teaches people to expect another one. Every impulsive reaction teaches them exactly which words can disturb your peace. Every moment spent defending yourself reveals where your emotional vulnerabilities still exist. This does not happen because others are always calculating or manipulative. It happens because human beings naturally learn from repeated patterns. If a certain behavior consistently produces the same response, people begin expecting that response without thinking about it. The remarkable thing is that this process works in both directions. The moment your behavior changes consistently, expectations begin changing as well. People slowly realize that provoking you no longer guarantees a reaction. Pressuring you no longer guarantees agreement. Demanding endless explanations no longer guarantees access to your time or attention. Nothing needed to be announced. Your conduct quietly communicated everything words once struggled to express. This is one reason emotional steadiness becomes so powerful over time. It removes predictability from the places where predictability once weakened you. A person who reacts impulsively can often be influenced by anyone who understands their emotional patterns. Praise becomes a tool for gaining approval. Criticism becomes a tool for creating insecurity. Anger becomes a tool for disrupting judgment. Without realizing it, many people spend years allowing others to shape their emotional state simply by pressing familiar psychological buttons. The Stoics warned against this because they believed true freedom begins only when another person's behavior no longer determines the condition of your own mind. Once that freedom begins developing, manipulation quietly loses much of its influence. Attempts to provoke no longer find the same emotional doorway because that doorway has gradually been closed through discipline. There is also a noticeable change in the way your words are received. Earlier in life, you may have felt compelled to explain every decision, justify every boundary, or defend every belief. Ironically, the more frequently you spoke in an attempt to convince others, the easier it became for your words to lose their significance. Constant explanation often weakens communication because listeners begin expecting endless clarification instead of careful intention. As your relationship with yourself becomes steadier, something else begins happening. You speak less often, but with greater purpose. You no longer feel responsible for filling every silence or correcting every misunderstanding. When you choose to speak, your words emerge from reflection instead of urgency. People notice this, even if they cannot explain why. Speech that comes from composure naturally carries more weight than speech driven by anxiety. The value of your words increases because they are no longer competing with unnecessary noise. Silence itself also begins changing its meaning. Earlier, silence may have felt uncomfortable because it seemed to invite misunderstanding or judgment. It felt as though every pause required immediate explanation. Over time, silence becomes something entirely different. It is no longer empty space waiting to be filled. It becomes evidence of self-command. You discover that not every question deserves an answer, not every accusation deserves a defense, and not every opinion deserves your emotional participation. Remaining silent no longer feels like losing control. It becomes one of the clearest expressions of it. This silence is not passive, nor is it rooted in fear. It is an active decision to protect your attention from conversations that cannot improve your life or strengthen your character. In many situations, silence communicates confidence more effectively than the most carefully prepared argument ever could. None of this means people will always understand your choices. Some may interpret your calm as indifference. Others may mistake your boundaries for distance. A few may even become frustrated because the version of you they once depended upon no longer exists. This is a natural part of growth. When one person changes long-established patterns, relationships often require time to adjust. Those who genuinely value mutual respect usually adapt. They recognize the difference between healthy boundaries and emotional withdrawal. Others may resist because they benefited from the old pattern more than you realized. Their discomfort does not necessarily mean you are doing something wrong. Sometimes it simply means the relationship is being invited into a healthier balance, where responsibility belongs equally to both people, rather than resting entirely on your willingness to accommodate. As this continues, your confidence begins resting on something much more stable than external approval. It no longer depends upon winning arguments, receiving constant praise, or ensuring everyone agrees with your choices. As Seneca wrote, "The greatest remedy for anger is delay." Confidence becomes quieter because it no longer needs continual confirmation from the outside world. You trust your ability to remain thoughtful even during disagreement. You trust your ability to remain patient when circumstances become uncertain. Most importantly, you trust yourself to protect your own peace without feeling guilty for doing so. That trust becomes visible in countless ordinary moments. You no longer rush. You no longer chase every misunderstanding. You no longer treat every emotional invitation as though it demands your presence. Instead, you choose deliberately where your attention belongs. Eventually, others begin recognizing something that cannot be manufactured through appearance or performance. They notice a person who cannot be easily hurried, easily offended, or easily manipulated. They encounter someone whose calm is not an act, but a habit built through countless quiet decisions made long before this conversation ever took place. Respect emerges naturally because consistency has replaced unpredictability. Your presence itself begins communicating what endless explanations never could. Without demanding recognition, you quietly demonstrate that real confidence is not found in controlling other people's opinions. It is found in controlling your own responses so faithfully that the world gradually learns where your attention ends, where your boundaries begin, and how much strength can exist inside a person who no longer feels compelled to react to everything that asks for a place in their mind. Perhaps the deepest transformation does not arrive when your circumstances improve. It arrives when you finally stop waiting for them to improve before allowing yourself to experience peace. For much of life, it is easy to believe that calm belongs somewhere in the future. You tell yourself that everything will settle down after this problem is solved, after this difficult person leaves your life, after this uncertainty disappears, or after one more goal has finally been reached. Peace becomes a reward constantly postponed by changing conditions. Each time one obstacle disappears, another quietly takes its place. The destination never arrives because it was attached to circumstances that were never designed to remain stable. The Stoics recognized this long ago. They understood that if tranquility depends entirely upon a world that constantly changes, then tranquility itself will always remain temporary. The only lasting peace is the kind that learns to exist while life continues unfolding with all of its uncertainty, imperfection, and unpredictability. This realization changes the way you look at nearly everything. Problems no longer become signs that something has gone wrong with your life. They become reminders of what life has always been. Every generation has faced uncertainty. Every person has experienced disappointment. Every human being has lived with unanswered questions and unexpected changes. The desire for a completely peaceful world is understandable, but reality has never made that promise. Storms come and go. Relationships evolve, plans fail, opportunities appear unexpectedly and disappear just as quickly. Trying to eliminate uncertainty before allowing yourself to feel at peace is like waiting for the ocean to stop producing waves before deciding to learn how to swim. The conditions you are waiting for may never arrive. Wisdom begins when you stop negotiating with reality and start strengthening the part of yourself capable of remaining steady within it. The Stoics never believed that peace meant escaping difficulty. They believed peace meant changing your relationship with difficulty. There is an enormous difference between those two ideas. One depends upon controlling the world. The other depends upon understanding yourself. When challenges appear, you no longer immediately ask how to eliminate them. Instead, you quietly ask how to meet them without losing yourself in the process. This simple shift creates extraordinary resilience because your stability is no longer tied to outcomes beyond your control. A difficult conversation remains difficult, but it no longer destroys your entire day. An unexpected setback still disappoints you, but it no longer convinces you that everything is falling apart. You stop measuring your life by the absence of problems and begin measuring it by the quality of your response whenever problems naturally appear. This does not happen because emotions disappear. There will still be moments of frustration, grief, uncertainty, and fear. Those experiences remain part of being fully human. The difference is that they no longer become permanent residents inside your mind. They arrive, they are acknowledged, they teach what they have to teach, and eventually they pass. Earlier in life, every emotion seemed capable of defining your reality. Now, emotions become visitors rather than rulers. They influence your awareness without governing your identity. That quiet distinction changes everything because it allows you to experience life honestly without becoming imprisoned by every feeling that moves through you. You stop resisting the existence of discomfort and begin trusting your ability to remain grounded even while discomfort is present. As this understanding deepens, your attention naturally begins returning to what has always mattered most. You notice simple moments that once disappeared beneath constant mental noise. A peaceful morning feels complete without requiring anything extraordinary to happen. A meaningful conversation becomes more valuable than winning another argument. Time spent learning, creating, reflecting, or quietly enjoying the people you care about begins carrying greater significance than proving yourself to those who never intended to understand you. Life itself has not become simpler. Your relationship with it has. You no longer divide each day into victories and defeats according to external events. Instead, you quietly observe whether you remained faithful to the values you have chosen to live by. That question becomes enough because it directs your attention towards something that has always been within your reach. Over time, this way of living stops feeling like a collection of techniques and starts becoming part of your character. You no longer remind yourself to pause before reacting because pausing has become natural. You no longer force yourself to release unnecessary resentment because resentment no longer feels worth carrying. You no longer struggle constantly against every anxious thought because you have learned that thoughts are not commands. The discipline that once required conscious effort slowly transforms into habit, and habit gradually becomes identity. This is how lasting change quietly unfolds. It is not created through one extraordinary moment, but through countless ordinary moments where you repeatedly choose clarity over confusion, patience over urgency, and purpose over impulse. People around you may notice the difference before you do. They see someone who remains steady when circumstances become uncertain. They notice that criticism no longer produces the same emotional reaction. They observe that you no longer seem hurried by the need to explain yourself or win every disagreement. Some may wonder what changed. The answer is surprisingly simple. You stopped expecting the world to protect your peace and accepted responsibility for protecting it yourself. That decision quietly altered everything that followed. External chaos continued because it always will. The news remained noisy. Opinions remained divided. Difficult people remained difficult. Yet your inner world gradually became less dependent upon those conditions because you had finally learned where real stability begins. Eventually, the meaning of success begins changing so gradually that you almost fail to notice it. There was a time when success seemed tied to outcomes that depended upon other people. Winning the argument, receiving recognition, earning approval, proving your point so clearly that no one could question it. Those victories often felt satisfying for a moment, yet the satisfaction rarely lasted. Another disagreement eventually appeared. Another misunderstanding demanded attention. Another opinion challenged your confidence. You found yourself chasing a finish line that continuously moved farther away because it depended upon circumstances you could never fully control. The Stoics recognized this quiet trap. They understood that any definition of success built upon changing opinions or temporary victories would always leave the mind restless. Lasting fulfillment had to be rooted somewhere more stable than the reactions of the world. As your perspective matures, you begin noticing victories that once would have passed completely unnoticed. You leave a difficult conversation without replaying it for the rest of the day. Someone misunderstands your intentions, yet you no longer feel compelled to spend hours defending yourself. A harsh opinion reaches your ears, but instead of quietly carrying it home, you allow it to remain where it belongs. These moments rarely receive applause because they happen entirely within your own mind. No audience witnesses the argument you chose not to continue. No one congratulates you for the resentment you quietly refused to carry. Yet these private victories begin feeling far more meaningful than public triumphs ever did, because they strengthen something that remains with you long after the conversation has ended. They strengthen your character rather than your reputation. This is one of the greatest shifts a person can experience. You stop measuring progress by how effectively you influence other people and begin measuring it by how consistently you govern yourself. Earlier in life, another person's behavior often determined your emotional state. Their praise lifted your confidence, their criticism diminished it. Their approval created peace, while their rejection quietly stole it away. Without realizing it, your inner life became dependent upon forces constantly changing outside your control. As that dependence weakens, an entirely different kind of stability begins emerging. You discover that your peace survives disagreement. Your confidence survives misunderstanding. Your sense of direction survives uncertainty. External events continue changing, but the foundation beneath them becomes increasingly difficult to shake because it is no longer built upon the fragile opinions of others. One of the clearest signs of this transformation appears during conflict. Earlier, conflict demanded immediate participation. Every disagreement felt like a test of intelligence, dignity, or worth. Walking away seemed impossible because silence felt too much like surrender. Over time, something quietly changes. You begin recognizing that not every battle deserves your attention. Some conversations no longer invite curiosity or understanding. They simply recycle familiar emotions without producing anything meaningful. Instead of entering every conflict automatically, you pause. You ask whether continuing serves your principles or merely satisfies your pride. That single moment of reflection often changes everything. You discover that preserving your peace is sometimes the wisest response available, even when another person mistakes it for weakness. Their interpretation no longer controls your decision because your values have become clearer than your desire to appear victorious. Criticism also begins carrying a different meaning. Instead of immediately defending yourself, you listen carefully enough to separate truth from projection. If the criticism reveals something useful, you accept it without allowing it to wound your identity. If it reflects another person's misunderstanding or frustration, you allow it to pass without building your life around it. This balance creates remarkable freedom because you are no longer trapped between arrogance and insecurity. You neither reject every difficult opinion nor accept every negative judgment as absolute truth. Instead, you evaluate each one with patience, allowing reason to speak before emotion decides what deserves your attention. That quiet discernment protects both your humility and your confidence at the same time. Uncertainty, too, begins losing much of its power over you. Earlier, every unanswered question seemed to demand immediate resolution. The future had to be predicted, controlled, or mentally rehearsed before you could relax. Now you begin trusting something you once overlooked. You trust your ability to meet reality when it actually arrives. Instead of exhausting yourself preparing for countless imagined outcomes, you conserve your energy for the only moment where meaningful action is possible. This does not eliminate uncertainty, it changes your relationship with it. The future remains unknown, but it no longer feels like an enemy waiting to surprise you. It becomes a space where possibilities remain open, where patience often proves wiser than prediction. Perhaps the greatest evidence of growth is the way you begin experiencing your own emotions. They continue appearing because they always will. Joy still visits. Sadness still arrives. Anger occasionally surfaces. Fear sometimes whispers familiar stories. The difference is that none of these experiences immediately take control of your life. They become companions rather than commanders. You acknowledge them without surrendering your judgment. You allow yourself to feel deeply without believing every feeling deserves immediate action. This quiet balance gives you something many people spend their entire lives searching for. It allows you to remain fully human without becoming imprisoned by every passing emotional current. Then, one ordinary day, without any dramatic announcement, you notice something that would have seemed impossible years earlier. You respond calmly to a situation that once would have consumed your thoughts. You walk away from unnecessary conflict without carrying bitterness into the next morning. You accept uncertainty without demanding impossible certainty. You listen more carefully than you defend. You protect your attention without feeling guilty for doing so. None of these moments seem extraordinary on their own, yet together they reveal a profound truth. The person you once admired for their steadiness, patience, and quiet confidence was never someone fundamentally different from you. They were simply someone who practiced these choices consistently until they became part of who they were. That is how real transformation unfolds, not through dramatic declarations or perfect days, but through countless ordinary decisions repeated until they quietly reshape your character. Success no longer depends upon proving yourself, collecting approval, or winning every disagreement. It becomes something far more enduring. It becomes the ability to remain grounded when circumstances invite chaos, to preserve your peace without withdrawing from life, and to carry yourself with a calm that cannot be purchased by praise or destroyed by criticism. Without seeking recognition, you gradually become the kind of person whose greatest victory is not over the world, but over the impulses that once kept the world in control of your mind. Perhaps this is the lesson that has been quietly waiting beneath every idea explored along the way. The world will never stop asking for your attention. There will always be another opinion demanding a response, another distraction presenting itself as something urgent, another criticism inviting you to defend yourself, another uncertainty tempting you to surrender your peace before reality has even spoken. That is simply the nature of life. The world has always been noisy, and it will remain noisy long after we are gone. The Stoics never promised an existence free from conflict because they understood such a promise could never be kept. Instead, they pointed towards something far more dependable. They reminded themselves that while they could not choose every circumstance they encountered, they could always choose the quality of the mind they brought into those circumstances. That quiet understanding became the foundation upon which everything else rested. It shifted attention away from the impossible task of controlling life and toward the far more meaningful responsibility of governing oneself. For much of life, it is easy to believe that freedom means having complete control over external events. We imagine that if people treated us fairly, if plans unfolded exactly as expected, and if uncertainty finally disappeared, then peace would naturally follow. Yet experience keeps teaching the same lesson in different forms. One problem disappears and another quietly takes its place. One goal is achieved, and almost immediately a new desire begins pulling the mind forward again. Waiting for perfect conditions becomes an endless negotiation with reality because reality was never designed to remain still. The seasons change, relationships evolve, circumstances shift without asking for permission. The person who ties peace to those changing conditions inevitably finds themselves pulled in every direction. The person who learns to anchor peace somewhere deeper discovers that life can remain unpredictable without becoming unbearable. That distinction changes everything because it reveals where true freedom has been waiting all along. There is a small space that exists within every difficult moment, although it often goes unnoticed. It appears between the event and the reaction, between the criticism and the response, between the disappointment and the conclusion. Most people move through that space so quickly they never realize it exists. Habit takes over before awareness has a chance to speak. The familiar emotion arrives, the familiar reaction follows, and another day unfolds according to patterns established years earlier. Yet the more carefully you observe your own mind, the more visible that quiet space becomes. It may last only a heartbeat at first, but within it lies every possibility for a different future. That brief pause contains patience instead of urgency, clarity instead of confusion, deliberate choice instead of automatic habit. Every meaningful transformation begins there because that is the place where character quietly reveals itself. The Stoics returned to this understanding again and again because they knew no philosophy could remove uncertainty from life. Their practice was never about becoming invincible or emotionless. It was about protecting that inner space where reason could still speak before impulse took control. They understood that another person's anger could not become your anger without your participation. An insult could not become suffering without your interpretation. A setback could not become defeat unless you accepted it as the final chapter instead of one passing moment within a much larger story. This way of living did not promise comfort in every circumstance. It offered something more enduring than comfort. It offered the ability to remain yourself regardless of what circumstances happened to surround you. As this understanding settles more deeply into your life, the desire to control everything outside yourself gradually fades. You stop chasing impossible certainty because you have learned to trust your ability to meet uncertainty with steadiness. You stop collecting unnecessary battles because you recognize how expensive they truly are. You become more careful with your attention because you finally understand that attention is not simply another resource. It is the direction in which your life quietly moves every single day. Whatever repeatedly occupies your mind slowly shapes your character. Whatever repeatedly receives your focus gradually becomes the world you experience from within. Protecting your attention therefore becomes far more than an exercise in productivity or discipline. It becomes an act of protecting the very quality of your existence. This realization also changes the meaning of strength. Strength is no longer measured by how loudly you defend yourself or how effectively you overpower another person's opinion. It is measured by your ability to remain faithful to your principles when emotions invite you elsewhere. It appears in the conversation you choose not to continue. It appears in the criticism you calmly examine instead of immediately resisting. It appears in the uncertainty you allow to exist without filling every empty space with fear. These moments rarely attract recognition because they happen quietly inside the mind, yet they shape a life more profoundly than dramatic victories ever could. Every deliberate response strengthens a habit that eventually becomes character, and character quietly determines the direction of every future decision. Over time, you begin realizing that becoming untouchable never meant becoming unreachable. It never meant building walls so high that nothing could affect you. It meant becoming rooted deeply enough that passing storms no longer uproot you. Joy still reaches you. Love still reaches you. Grief still reaches you. Disappointment still arrives from time to time because those experiences belong to being fully alive. The difference is that none of them permanently take possession of your inner world. They visit, they teach what they have to teach, and they eventually pass, leaving your deeper sense of self intact. You no longer mistake temporary emotional weather for your permanent identity. That quiet stability becomes one of the greatest forms of freedom a person can know. In the end, the world will continue speaking with countless voices. Some will praise you, others will criticize you, some will understand your intentions, while others never will. Circumstances will continue changing according to rhythms beyond your control, just as they always have. None of that truly belongs to you. What has always belonged to you is something infinitely more valuable. It is the ability to choose where your attention rests, how your character responds, and what kind of person each ordinary moment is quietly shaping you into. Guard that space with care because it is where your freedom lives. Protect your attention because it determines the life you experience from within. Govern your own mind with patience and consistency, and one day you will discover that the peace you spent so many years searching for was never waiting somewhere beyond the world. It was quietly growing each time you chose yourself over impulse, wisdom over reaction, and inner mastery over the endless noise surrounding you. The world will always ask for more of your attention than it deserves. It will tempt you to react, to explain, to chase approval, and to carry burdens that were never yours. But every moment you choose clarity over impulse, peace over pride, and wisdom over noise, you reclaim another part of yourself. That is the quiet path of Stoicism, and it is a journey worth walking every single day. If this reflection spoke to you, don't let it end here. Continue strengthening your mind by watching one of the videos now on your screen. Each one is another step toward greater clarity, resilience, and inner freedom. Thank you for being part of Stoic Journal. Until next time, guard your attention, protect your peace, and take care.